ahead, Council President. We're live.
Morning. We're going to get started now. Let's read a brief script as required by law. That the state law currently requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health emergency, City Council committees are currently meeting remotely. We are using Microsoft Teams to make these remote hearings possible. Instruction for how the public may view and offer public testimony at public hearings of council committees are included in the public hearing notices that are published in the Daily News, Inquirer, and Legal Intelligencer. It can also be found on phlcouncil.com. I now note that the hour has come. Mr. Stitt, would you please call the roll to take attendance? Members that are in attendance will please indicate that you are present when your name is called. Also, just say a word or two to make sure that the feed for Channel 64 comes on as a result of multiple words being spoken. Mr. Stitt.
Councilmember Bass.
Good morning, I'm present. How are you?
Thank you. Councilmember Brooks.
Good morning, I'm here.
Councilman Dom.
Good morning, Council President, colleagues, and administration.
Councilmember Gauthier.
Good morning, Council President. Good morning, colleagues.
Councilmember Gilmore Richardson.
Good morning, Mayor. Good morning, Council President, and good morning, colleagues. Happy Tuesday.
Yeah, we hope so.
Councilman Green.
Good morning, Council colleagues. Good to hear you and see you this morning.
Councilwoman McGinn.
Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Council President. Look forward to this conversation.
Absolutely.
Councilman Heenan. Councilman Johnson. Councilman Jones.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, administration. Good morning, viewing public.
Morning.
Councilman O.
Good morning, Council President, colleagues, everyone.
Morning.
Councilman O'Neill.
Good morning, everyone.
Hey.
Councilwoman Parker.
Good morning, Council President Clark and colleagues.
Morning.
Councilwoman Kiona Sanchez.
Good morning, everyone. Look forward to today. Thank you.
Councilman Squilla.
Good morning, Matt, Council President, colleagues.
Morning.
Councilman Thomas.
Good morning, Council President. Good morning, Matt, everybody on the call from the administration. Good morning, and of course, good morning to my colleagues.
Morning.
And Council President Clark.
All right. Morning again. We have a clearly established quorum. We'll get started. Before we dive into what I'm sure will be a very informative session, I'd like to say a few words about today's process. The coronavirus pandemic has changed the world, and that includes this council. So we're not in the same room, and to be honest, I really don't like that. I miss my guys, I miss my colleagues, but right now it requires that we keep our distance. But we have a job to do, and with this technology that our IT team has just installed will let us do it in a way that allows the public to watch and participate. This new environment comes with some new limits, however, which I want to emphasize to you. Our budget schedule is more compressed than in past years, and the massive damage to our economy caused by COVID-19 required that the administration throw out the original proposed budget and prepare a brand new one, which we didn't receive until earlier this month. So we have less time in these hearings than we're used to, a lot less time, and we need to be mindful of that. So out of respect for each other, each of us needs to be as direct as possible in our questions and then brief in our comments. And we're actually going to ask those individuals from the administration that respond to respond as directly as possible also, so we can get in as many inquiries as possible. So because of the 1 o'clock briefing every day, as a result of the mayor's briefing, as you know, we're being asked to conclude our session by 12:30. So therefore, we're really asking us to expedite our questions and response before we lose our television feed, because under the Sunshine Law, we are required to have live feed and live television feed. So we have a lot to cover. So let's get started. This is the public hearing, the committee of the whole, regarding bills number 200-285, 200-286, 200-287, 200-288, 200-289, 200-290, 200-291, 200-292, and resolution number 200-307. Mr. Stitt, will you please read the titles of the bills and the resolution?
Bill number 200-285, an ordinance to adopt a capital program for the 6 fiscal years 2021 through 2026 inclusive. Bill number 200-286, an ordinance to adopt the fiscal 2021 capital budget. Bill number 200-287, an ordinance adopting the operating budget for fiscal year 2021. Bill number 200-288, an ordinance amending Chapter 19-1200 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Parking Tax by revising certain tax rates under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 200-289, an ordinance amending Chapter 19-1800 of the Philadelphia Code entitled School Tax Authorization by revising certain tax rates all under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 200-290, an ordinance amending Chapter 19-2600 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Business Income and Receipts Taxes by revising certain tax rates under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 200-291, an ordinance amending Chapter 19-1500 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Wage and Net Profits Tax by revising certain tax rates under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 200-292, an ordinance amending Chapter 19-1300 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Real Estate Taxes to eliminate the discount for early payment of real estate taxes, all under certain terms and conditions. Resolution number 200-307, resolution providing for the approval by the Council of the City of Philadelphia of a revised 5-year financial plan for the City of Philadelphia covering fiscal years 2021 through 2025 and incorporating proposed changes with respect to fiscal year 2020, which is to be submitted by the Mayor to the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority pursuant to the Intergovernmental Cooperation Agreement authorized by an ordinance of this Council approved by the Mayor on January 3, 1992, Bill number 1563-A, by and between the City and the Authority.
Thank you, Mr. Stitt. Today, we continue the public hearing of the Committee of the Whole to consider the bills just read by the clerk that constitute proposed operating and capital spending measures for fiscal 2021, a capital program, and a forward-looking capital plan for fiscal 2021 through fiscal 2026. Before we begin to hear testimony from the witnesses we have for today, everyone who has been invited to the meeting to testify should be aware that the public hearing is being recorded. Because the hearing is public, participants and the viewers have no reason to expect any level of privacy. By continuing to be in this meeting, you are consenting to being recorded. Additionally, prior to recognizing members for the questions or comments they have for witnesses, I will note for the record, at this time we will use the chat feature available in the Microsoft Teams to allow members to signify that they wish to be recognized. In order to comply with the Sunshine Act, the chat feature must only be used for this particular purpose. Today, our lineup will include testimony from Finance Department and Commerce. For the Finance Department, we will talk about tax bills, budget, revenue, treasurer, sinking fund, pensions, and OPA. Mr. Stitt, the first person to testify from the administration is?
Rob Dubow and the Finance Departments.
Sir.
Morning.
Morning.
Council President and members of council, thanks for the opportunity to testify in support of the FY21 budgets for the Office of the Director of Finance, the Revenue Department, the Office of Property Assessment, in my role as chair for the Board of Pensions and Retirement, the Sinking Fund Commission, and the City Treasurer's Office. I'm joined by First Deputy Kat Lamb, Deputy Finance Director Elizabeth Hanley, and the agency heads and deputies of all the entities included in the finance group. Collectively, our offices are responsible for a range of functions, including tracking the city's spending, processing payments and payroll, monitoring grants, allocating the city's precious resources, analyzing performance against budget, implementing new financial and HR systems, ensuring the accuracy of property data, accurately assessing properties, collecting revenue and managing relief programs, managing the city's debt portfolio and cash, and ensuring that the city retirees receive their benefits in a fiscally prudent manner. You've received a written testimony from all the agencies in the finance group. Those testimonies detail their specific budget requests for the year and describe what the be particularly focused on ensuring the city's long and short-term fiscal health as we continue to prioritize keeping Philadelphians safe, healthy, and educated. In the interest of time, I'll conclude my testimony there, and we'd be happy to take any questions. Should I go right to the tax testimony now, or do you want to do questions and then the tax testimony?
Let's do the tax testimony.
Okay. So I'm here to testify in support of bills number 200-288, 289, 290, 291, and 292. In putting together the revised FY21 budget and the FY21-25 five-year plan, the administration faced a series of painful choices and had to decide between bad choices. With the onset of COVID-19 and the ensuing economic shutdown, Philadelphia faced a $649 million budget gap in FY21. No one wants to have to cut services and no one wants to increase taxes, but to close that gap, we had to do both. Before doing that, to minimize the impact on Philadelphia residents, businesses, and employees, we used the reserves that we had built up over time in an attempt to build up a buffer against an economic downturn. This addressed about a third of the problem. The remaining two-thirds of the gap had to come from spending reductions and revenue increases. With businesses closed, the economic impact of COVID-19 has resulted in layoffs, business closures across industry sectors, and with even those not yet impacted, feeling great uncertainty. In that kind of environment, there are limited options for seeking revenues, and given the constraints, plus our desire to preserve as many services as possible for Philadelphians, administration proposed limiting changes to revenues, totaling about $50 million in the general fund. That's a 9%, it means that 9% of the revenue loss came from revenue enhancements. In other words, the administration closed 90% of the gap before turning to revenue increases. And we only turned to revenue increases to avoid even more crippling service cuts. We lay out in the testimony some of the details of each of the changes, but since you have the testimony, I won't go through each of those. I'll just conclude by saying we remain committed to moving towards a tax structure that supports an inclusive, thriving economy and financial stability for our residents. But the long-standing problems of our city's poverty and the constraints of the Uniformity Clause prevent a more progressive approach, and they're now compounded by the economic devastation brought by COVID-19. At the same time, we wanted to avoid additional service cuts that would jeopardize the health, safety, or education of Philadelphians. Together, council administration faced very difficult decisions about how to best meet the needs of Philadelphians with far fewer resources than they deserve. We thank council for their thoughtful and swift consideration of this legislation, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. DeVoe. Just have a couple of quick questions on my end. And I just want to remind members that we're doing 5 minutes in the first round, so I'll try to adhere to that particular request. One question I actually meant to ask yesterday, Mr. DeVoe, and it kind of got by me, the issue with respect to poverty. As you know, the City Council of Philadelphia, the administration, a number of other entities formed a group, a special committee on poverty, and we put together what we believe to be a very, very aggressive but a significant plan. Everybody kind of bought into it, and it was a commitment of a certain level of support, i.e. revenue from the city to implement that proposal. where are we at with that? I know, and I'm assuming you know that there's going to be some debate about that issue with respect to it not showing up in the budget based on the earlier commitment.
Right, and that was clearly a commitment we would have liked to have been able to keep, but with the devastation that our budget faced with the revenue losses, we weren't able to keep all of that commitment. So we tried to keep as much as we could, but clearly couldn't keep it all.
How much do you think you kept?
I'd probably have to get back to you with more specifics and do kind of a crosswalk of what was in there before of the poverty program and what's in there now.
All right. I mean, I need to have that answer today before we finish this testimony, because that's very important. We'll probably need more support because unfortunately we'll probably have more people in poverty as a result of the pandemic. So priorities are priorities, but if that's not a priority, I don't know what else is. And there's a direct correlation to poverty as it relates to other issues that we are spending money on. So, you know, the question is, do you support the front side to assist you on the back side based on individuals being in poverty? It causes a lot of other challenges for individuals as it relates to expenditures by the city. So please give me that number. Important, and that will be a significant part of the debate over the next couple of weeks. There's a question with respects to, and I actually asked this yesterday, I didn't necessarily ask the question, but I referenced it, this issue about the non-resident wage tax. And, you know, as you know, and I'm sure you all heard from a number of individuals and legislators from outside the city of Philadelphia who represent those individuals who live outside but work in the city. And I had some conversations with a number of individuals who represent certain aspects of businesses that people are now working remote. And they told me that having to pay the wage tax generally was a disincentive to some degree, but they've accepted that. And now this issue about having an additional wage tax, in their words, burden placed on them as they make decisions about whether or not they move those services and those workers back into the city. This will not be a beneficial determinant as it relates to those decisions on whether or not they bring folks back in. Have you all given any thought to that, or have you had conversations?
We did give thought to that, and we understood that for everything we were doing, there were trade-offs, and that there were pros and cons to everything. That's part of the reason we tried to keep that reduction as small as possible. I think it's about maybe a 1.6% increase, so it's a relatively small increase that played an important part in closing our gap. But we did definitely think about trying to keep that as small as possible so as not to provide a further disincentive for working in the city.
Were there any conversations with the business community about that before you made the decision to propose that?
We had a briefing with the business community as we put the final touches on the budget, but we didn't ask their opinion before we did it.
Didn't ask their opinion?
No, and part of the reason is because we had to redo the budget and find $650 million in basically 3 weeks. So the kind of process that we usually want to go through, we didn't really have a chance to go through in putting this together.
Okay. Now I want to add another question, and I'm going to actually adhere to the guidelines that I requested. The issue with respect to the parking tax, proposed increase of parking tax that generated around $17 million. Do you have data on who actually parks in these lots? Because I think in the testimony yesterday, remember the administration referenced some relationship to the minority population in the city of Philadelphia in utilizing parking lots and the number of cars that they had. And I didn't quite get the connection because I thought that most of the parking, particularly downtown, garages were not most, but a significant were used by people outside of the city.
Yeah, so I'm gonna ask Marissa to answer that question because she did a lot of analysis of that.
Good morning. Hi, Marissa Waxman, Budget Director. So yesterday, what I had referenced was information that's in the city's Connect plan, the transit plan, that was looking at availability of vehicles by race in Philadelphia in terms of, who has vehicles and who doesn't, to understand who may be affected by this. And so we looked at data around just the availability of a car whatsoever, not necessarily connecting that to who parks in the garage, but who even has a car to be parked. And there were significant racial disparities in terms of car availability by household, by race in Philadelphia, with white households having almost double the amount of car availability. And we can share the figures from that plan. And so when trying to figure out who might be parking, because we don't have that data, just looking at who owns cars or has cars available to them.
Okay, so there's really no documented relationship between people of color versus suburbanites and all the others in terms of parking. You brought it up, and I was just wondering what the relationship was. Why you brought it up, and
what we were thinking was, if you don't have a car, you're unlikely to be paying the parking tax, and so that's where we saw that there were gaps and disparities. So who was more likely to be parking? Obviously folks with cars. And then we also look at where the parking happens, and the largest parking tax receipts are from Center City, second largest from the airport, third largest in University City. And then obviously those are areas where we think there's a real mix then of Philadelphians and folks from outside the city coming in to park.
Yeah, but don't you think most of the people in the reference communities are likely to take public transit versus driving into those very high-priced parking garages and lots in Center City and University City?
That's what we were thinking, is that Philadelphians, particularly those without cars, would not be as affected by an increase in the parking tax because they're more likely to take public transit or have alternative transportation needs. So we were trying to figure out how, in all of the bad choices before us for different tax and revenue enhancements, which ones would be the lightest on folks, particularly communities of color, low-income Philadelphians, because they'd be less likely, compared to if it was a more broad-based Philadelphia-based tax that cannot be avoided.
Okay. All right. Just want to get some clarity. All right. Thank you. I'm going to try my best to adhere to the guidelines, so I'm actually going to pass it over to Councilwoman Parker, the first up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, you saved me some time because you actually touched on my first two questions. And so I heard both Marissa and Rob's response, but just want to note for the record that I too have concerns relative to many of our larger firms in the city who they've been resistant to the employees working from home in the past, but now they've gotten a little taste of it. And they know what it's like, and the sky didn't fall in. And in fact, they could look at things like their utility costs have decreased, printing costs could have decreased. And in other words, we have to be very mindful that many employees could begin to say, guess what? We're going to let more of you begin to work from home. And with the wage tax being the largest revenue generator for the city of Philadelphia and our general fund revenues, I just really ask that while we're working through this process, I know our colleagues will keep that in mind. The next thing I wanted to state, to follow up on the Council President's questions about the parking tax, I just needed to, and I don't need you to answer it because I heard your response to him, but our parking rate is already higher than our other peer cities. In addition to that, I want us to think about where we are in this phase in our economy when we have fewer people who are first driving to the city for work. But in addition to that, all of the entertainment and the tourism reasons that people would have to come, they no longer have to drive to the city. And finally, let me say this. Even if they do drive into the city now, they're unlikely to get a parking ticket if they say, look, I'm not going to park in a lot. I'm going to park on the street now. They're unlikely to get a parking ticket because the PPA is currently not enforcing meters and kiosks and the residential parking time limits. So, I will be listening very carefully to see how we think that if we raise the parking rate, it could bring in that additional $16.9 million. Next, Rob, I want you, if you will, to talk about what I believe is very important, and that's the retirement security for our workers here in Philadelphia. And I want to start with some good news. I was really pleased to hear that our pension fund had received an award from GFOA's, the Government Financial Office Association, for excellence in government finance. And it's with that in mind, Rob, that I know the city has worked very hard over the past few years to shore up the pension system. Give us a snapshot of the current health of the pension system and some of the new threats that have because of COVID. So when we talk about unfunded liability, what's that number? Tell us how much of that is attributed to the legacy costs, and just quickly walk us through it if you can.
I will, and then I'll probably turn it over to Fran Bielli to supplement what I say. Thank you for mentioning the award. The board was very proud of that, and it represents work that we've all done. The board, the administration, our unions, city council, the state legislature, when you were chair of the delegation. The fund before COVID-19 had gotten much healthier than it had been. We have consistently made our assumptions more conservative. And even while that was happening, our funded percent was going up. It got up into around 48, 49%, which obviously isn't where we want to be, but it was on a steady road to improvement. As you know, we put in place the revenue recognition policy, which meant that we were paying more than the amount that the state requires. And that was through a combination of sales tax revenue and additional employee contributions. And because of our following the revenue recognition policy, when Pew did a study that compared where Philadelphia's pension fund was to some other large pension funds, they found that we were better able to withstand things like downturns in the market. With that said, it's obviously never a good thing when the market does what it did once back in March. That has led to losses throughout the country. For the pension fund, those losses, the last update I saw were in the -3 to 4% range. So obviously not where we want to be, but not as bad as it could have been.
Now, Rob, if you can you give me the number when we talk about the total number that we would have to list for unfunded liability? What's that number?
Yeah, let me turn it over to Fran to give the specific numbers.
Good morning, Councilwoman Parker. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you, Fran, and congratulations again.
Thank you. So, yes, so just a couple of numbers. After the markets increased yesterday, we are largely flat on the fiscal year. So we are not minus on the fiscal year. We are largely flat, and that's a rough estimate. The unfunded liability, which you ask about, actually decreased this past fiscal year by 2.24%. So that's 2 consecutive years where the unfunded liability, due largely to the revenue recognition policy that Rob alluded to, that council helped implement, we reduced the unfunded liability 2.1% and then 2.24% in the last 2 fiscal years. That's because the additional contributions by the city, by the employees, and the additional sales tax revenue is dedicated to paying down the unfunded liability as opposed to reducing the city's contribution. So that's a very good thing. The funding level did go up to 49.7% from 46.8%. That's almost a 3% increase. That's one of the largest increases that we have seen. And that was only on a return of 5.66% for last fiscal year.
Got it, Fran. I just heard the bell, so that means that my time is up. But what's the actual amount? Is it the $6 billion was the number that we used? Where are we now?
Yes, it was 6.1. It decreased to 5.9. And of that number, approximately 85%, which is the question you asked previously, is due to the old Plan 67, which a new person has not gone into since 1992.
Thank you so much. And Mr. President, on the next round, I'll be very specifically asking about the Commerce Department's budget, the number of cuts and employees that they have made or will have to make on the second round. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Chair recognizes Councilman Heenan. Councilman Heenan.
Council President, I am fine for now. Thank you so much.
Fine, okay. Councilman Green.
Good morning, Council President. Good morning, Mr. DeBoe. I just want to follow up on some of the questions that my colleagues have asked regarding the impact of the parking tax, the wage tax, and some of the other tax proposals on the administration. In the work that IHS Global did in their projections, did you project what impact those tax increases would have in reference to COVID-19 and the fact that people are now possibly not coming back to the city because of them working at home, especially in the suburbs?
Yes, that was included, but I'll ask Marissa to give some more details about exactly how they included it.
Hi, good morning again. So yeah, for the wage tax, what we did was obviously we looked at, what would happen, if we made no changes, both to the non-resident rate as well as if folks just sort of continued to be where they normally were. And that led to projecting some decreases for FY21. When we then factored in the fact that a portion of the folks that are able to work remotely may continue to permanently work remotely, as well as the impact of putting in an increase on the non-resident side, we basically increased the decline by another 30%. So we made it 30% worse for FY21 to sort of reset the base low. And then from there, once the sort of impact, once people have made that decision, we don't think that they'll, that'll continue to compound over time. We're just starting from a lower place and then grow up again from there as the economy improves. So basically, to account for those two things, both a permanent shift of folks staying out in the suburbs, as well as the impact of raising the non-resident rate, changed our decline rate from negative 4.47 to negative 6%.
And so you don't think that impact will decline over time? And that's why by 22, 23, 24, revenues will bounce back after the decline initially?
We were anticipating that basically that decision would be made now, not that folks would come back to the city and then go back out to the suburbs, but that the decision would be made in FY21.
But don't you think as other firms start to do that and they see the possible benefits of having people work remotely, don't you think people work on companies? That's my concern. I've talked to a lot of impact by this return to cities, and they're now really actively out to bring people back out to the suburbs. Think about the issue. The other challenges, one, get back.
Councilman, I don't know if it's just me, but I'm not hearing your question.
Councilman, we're not hearing you.
I'm sorry.
I'll extend your time by a minute.
You don't hear me? All right, let me put in my earpiece if you don't hear me.
Sure.
How about now?
Yeah.
Okay. So what my point was that don't you think that will continue to exasperate over time as more and more businesses start to hear about the benefits of their employees working from home in the suburbs? And when you have the concern about physical distancing, as opposed to it being a one-time situation, it could be a growing and growing scenario especially as you have suburban office locations who are now trying to bring people back to the suburbs after people wanting to come to the city. Is that a concern?
Yeah, it's definitely a concern. Part of the offset of that is there's the part of this that, whatever the city does with the tax rate, there's what we can't change. And then with the tax rate, those impacts, when we implement the incremental reduction starting in FY24, that should mitigate that again. And so I think we'll see both of those coming into play over the coming years.
Yeah, but I think the concern is the message that it sends. The message that it sends is that we're going to increase the non-resident wage tax, we're going to increase things like parking tax, the real estate tax, and it sends a message to the citizens in the city of Philadelphia and also those who work in the city but live outside the city. In a couple of years, we're going to have to deal with the PICA tax. As the council president already talked about, the General Assembly has some concerns about this increase on non-resident wage tax. It could have been one thing if you had to do an increase, if you did it for FY21, but then looking at your own numbers, 22, 23, and 24, revenues bounce back. So why would you not do it in FY21 and not continue it in 22, 23, 24?
That was the recommendation we got from IHS, the economists that the city used, about when we should time that impact. But it's something that we'll certainly monitor to see if that changes over time.
And the other concern I had, I know I've communicated both with you and Rob quite a bit in my role as a board member of the National League of Cities, we do anticipate some type of revenue reimbursement. Now, I know we can't specifically budget for that now. We also cannot do interim taxation, but in the out years, and you do have an agreed revenue of $650 million, I think, give or take, that includes some of those dollars. But my concern is, why don't we look at that for FY22, 23, and 24, and send a message that if we have to do some type of taxes, it's a short time to get through FY21, but in the out years, we don't expect to make those changes and we go back.
So I think if we do get additional funding from the federal government and that money allows us to replace revenue loss, I think that's definitely something that we should consider doing.
But you've already baked the taxes in going forward. So I'll come back on that question a little bit later because my time is almost up. Two other things. I know we're talking about increasing real estate taxes, and I believe we have an interim person in as the head of Office of Property Assessment. Assessments have been a problem for a number of years. In addition, the implementation of CAM has been a challenge. My understanding, CAM is now up and running. How can we tell the citizens in the city of Philadelphia we're going to increase real estate taxes when we've had consistent challenges with assessments? And I'm not even sure we have a person in at the head of Office of Property Assessment.
So we do have a person at the head of the Office of Property Assessment. We have interim, that's true, but we have someone there who's got years of experience. We also do have CAM in place, which should make the process more efficient next year. And as part of the process this year, we're hiring an outside firm to audit our process as we go along, so that if they think we're doing something that doesn't make sense, we will alter the process as we're doing it. And we think that will help improve the process this year.
I know the council president gave me 1 extra minute, so I'm just going to ask this question and I'll wait to hear the answer. Right now, revenue and license inspection, from my understanding, are not sharing information. And you have people that have a business privilege license or tax account, but then they're having a different account for the actual taxation. Why is revenue and L9 not reconciling information?
I believe that they do work with each other, but I'll let Commissioner Breslin give more details on that.
Hi. Yes, we work closely with L&I and Revenue. We actually have, periodic meetings, go over how we can exchange data. There's some challenges when think those meetings will continue to evolve and how we can continue to exchange data. But we have been exchanging data and have had a very successful, I think, exchange of data for the last few years.
Okay, that's not my understanding, but I'll come back in the second round. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Councilman. Chair recognizes Councilman Don.
Thank you, Council President, and good morning, everyone. I just want to echo my colleagues, Council President Clark, and also Councilman Green. My concern, several concerns, but one of them is the messaging that we're sending. And I'm going to give you this example. I don't think there'll be a restaurant in the city that will open up after this pandemic and charge a higher price to customers coming into their restaurant. And I'm not sure the city should be charging more for you coming into the city. It's the same concept in my opinion. But having said that, I have a few quick specific questions. One is on the overtime controls. It says in the reports, according to the quarterly city managers reports, since fiscal year 17, the administration has added 2,222 new employees to general fund expenses. We've been told every year that new hires would help alleviate the overtime expenditures, but the administration has spent almost $100 million more than it budgeted for overtime. Now we're faced with the unprecedented revenue shortfalls. What is this administration's plan to rein in these overtime expenditures and control the spending?
Right. So there are, in the budget, there are some specific areas of overtime reduction. So, for example, police department is showing reduction in overtime. I believe fire department is also showing reduction in overtime, and they will monitor their overtime. They'll make sure that any overtime that's used is needed. Not all overtime is bad. Overtime can be an effective management tool, but I mean, you're right that it has to be monitored, and we have to make sure it's used appropriately. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Marissa.
All right. One additional thing that I would like to note in that increase is that we have also been shifting Class 100 staff labor costs from the capital budget to the operating budget that accounts for some of that, which is, we believe, a really good fiscal practice that we shouldn't be using money that we borrow and pay interest on for today's salaries. We want to really focus that on the infrastructure investments. And so that's also coming into play when you look at the general fund Class 100 numbers over the past couple of years.
I guess my concern is that for the last, from 17, 18, and 19, our overtime budgets for those years totaled $419 million, but we spent $512 million. We went over by almost $100 million. So whatever we can do to control that $100 million would be a big help in closing some of these budget gaps. Let me ask another question on efficiencies and effectiveness, because that should be one of our goals in this budget. So we haven't heard a ton about where investments and efficiencies have been made to offset some longer-term costs or improve performance. Understanding your office's involvement in performance through the QCMR, can you kind of explain where the administration plans to invest in efficiencies in our operations that could result in spending reductions in fiscal year 21 or 22? And any idea what that anticipated savings might be, and if we can ramp that up?
So go ahead, Mercy. Look, you're ready to go.
Okay, so I don't have a total number, but what we can do is definitely get back to you with some core examples. It's interesting that sometimes you don't want to waste a crisis. And so a number of things that we're looking at are processes that used to be paper-driven, in-person, that are now happening electronically, remotely. And so those are areas where we're finding some opportunities for efficiencies within the OIT budget. And when they come for the hearing with CAO, they may be able to speak to this more in depth. But some of the ways that they were able to find some savings was really inventory a number of the different sort of softwares that were being used by different departments and figure out what things were sort of built into some packages that we already have access to citywide, and make sure that those are being used consistently and ramp down some maybe standalone softwares. And so we're looking for those efficiency improvements about where we can sort of standardize our technology use, as well as just sort of remove some of the steps and processes. And I think that's really a work in progress that right now that work has started basically because we had no other choice to start that.
Right.
But there'll also be sort of a parallel looking at, okay, what things is just a workaround that, you know, is short-lived and we actually need to, you know, reinstate versus what things can we say, oh, this actually works better now. And so we're in that process right now.
So, you know, this crisis is a tremendous opportunity for us to become way more efficient in government. And I guess I don't know this answer, but I'm going to ask you the question. Do we have incentives built in for people who work in government who come to you with an idea that can make us more efficient and save us money?
We do not, but it's an interesting idea that we should discuss.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I would love to reward people that save us a ton of money. It'd be great. Anyway, thank you. I'll be respectful, and I'll come back in the second round. Thank you very much. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman, you may blow out City Council's budget because our people have ideas all the time. So we got to be careful about that.
That's good, though.
Yeah. Chair recognizes Councilwoman Brooks.
Thank you, Council President. I have about 2 questions, and the rest of them I will send electronically. The first one is, given our new economic landscape, can you explain whether it makes sense for us to re-examine the tenured property tax abatement, which I noted yesterday as the most generous abatement of its kind in the country, I'm sorry.
I think we're probably at a place where we should be re-examining everything in our tax structure. I don't think we probably have time to do that before this budget has to be approved, but I think that's something we should do during the fall.
Okay, and my second question is the city seeking funds from the Municipal Liquidity Facility, which is established by the Federal Reserve to replace the lost revenue due to the COVID-19? If so, what are we seeking it for, and what's the status of the application, and has it been submitted?
Sure. So the Municipal Liquidity Fund is really an alternate way of doing cash borrowings to even out your cash during the year. So we had not actually had to do any cash flow borrowings for the last few years because our cash position was very strong. There's a very strong likelihood we'll do a cash borrowing this year. And the Municipal Liquidity Facility has a set price, an interest rate price that you have to pay to use it. We will see whether we can do better than that price in the market, and if we can, we won't use the facility. If we can't, we will use the facility. I'll also ask Christian Dunbar whether there's anything he wants to add to that.
Thank you, Rob. No, I think you covered the main points in terms of the liquidity facility. You know, again, it's not sort of new borrowing, if you will, or access to different types of spending. It really is just a cash flow evening out for the city. And to Rob's point, we have access to the capital markets now. The difference between the facility and what we end up doing, whether it's the facility or the private markets, will really depend on ultimately the price.
Also, with the decreased revenue and emergency expenses, Philadelphia only immediate option other than cutting expenses are debt. Are we going to the bond market, and what does that process look like? And who are the people or entities that currently own a bulk of the city's $8.4 billion debt?
So we do borrow regularly for our capital needs. We don't borrow for operating for a number of reasons, including that you then wind up having to pay that debt service off over the long term for a cost you're incurring right away. So you have a debt that you're paying off while you're not getting the benefit. It also increases our fixed costs, and our fixed costs are already really high, so we don't want to increase those. And because of how negatively the markets look at borrowing to cover operations, it would mean that all our other borrowings would be more expensive. But I'll let Christian give a more detailed answer.
No, I think you really covered it, Rob. I mean, generally, the market's not just investors, but also the rating agencies will look at borrowing for operations as not a best practice. And so what could tend to happen is anytime we are borrowing in the bond market, investors really pay attention to what we're borrowing for. And if it's not considered essential in terms of capital expenditures, then it will certainly want to receive a higher return on those types of borrowings. And the rating agencies may look at that, again, as a bad practice. And could potentially, you never know when a rating action will come, particularly when you're talking about an environment where our overall fund balance will likely dip to less than 2%. We certainly don't want to trigger rating actions, which will have a negative effect on all future borrowings until our credit rating can be restored.
Kristen, can you talk about what we try to do to lower our cost of borrowing and what we do with refundings?
Absolutely. So year in and year out, we are constantly monitoring our entire debt portfolio, which is roughly between 8 and 9 billion currently. And so we receive refund analysis on an almost monthly basis to take advantage of opportunities from a refunding perspective. So before COVID, there were a lot of really attractive refunding opportunities from a taxable perspective. Since COVID, tax exempt and taxable rates have really widened out. So that's really prevented us from doing some of the refundings we would have otherwise done. But over the last 4 years, we have really tried to refund as many bonds as we can in the marketplace. And so again, we continue to monitor that on a pretty monthly basis for opportunities to refund. Certainly there's a process when we think about refunding, and we continuously go through it, and we monitor it on a regular basis, and that includes with our financial advisors as well as our investment banks in New York.
Thank you, Christian.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Chair recognizes Councilwoman Kiona Sanchez.
Thank you, Council President. I want to thank the Council President for highlighting the discussion around the poverty plan and the importance of that process where we talked about investing in people and not in inefficient programs. And so I too will wait anxiously as we had allocated $25 million to the initiation of new strategies where 100 plus subject experts participated in a process to how do we support people and meet them where they are. So I look forward to that discussion. I also want to echo the sentiments of Councilwoman Parker as it relates to the wage and the parking and, the assumption that we're going to get 100% of a new tax, given the climate of people learn to work from home, and given the social distancing requirements that businesses will have, the unlikelihood of people are going to come back for 5 days. And so as we look at these revenue projections, and I know it's still early in this process, how's that going to impact the out of county workers in our downtown is something that we're all interested in doing. A couple of weeks ago, or actually about 6 weeks ago, I had asked the Revenue Department for a series of analysis around BERT and others. I was told as early as late as this morning that I would get that information, and I was hopeful because that information was going to help inform some of the questions I have around the massive decrease of BERT, and I haven't gotten the data yet. And so when I get the data, Council President Clark, we may have to ask the administration to come back, because as we look at small businesses and businesses in the corridor, I'm particularly concerned about how we're projecting out their return to recovery. But that said, we don't have money, and we saw that in the amount of investments that we made to the Small Business Fund, that we're not going to have enough. Can the administration speak to what is going to be the changes in our collection strategies so that we can help people navigate crisis to recovery, particularly small businesses who still have to pay taxes, both property taxes. Now we're asking them for additional trash fee money and they're not even there. So tell me what the collection strategy is going to be for the next 6 months to a year, and how we're going to help people comply and meet those obligations for small businesses.
Sure, I'll ask Commissioner Breslin to do that. We have taken a number of steps to try to make that easier, but I'd like Marissa to talk for just a second about the assumptions we made about the parking tax and what that would mean in terms of usage.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that we share that we didn't assume that there was no elasticity or no change in the parking tax base based on obviously what's going on generally in the economy as well as with the changes that we are making. So we had gotten projections in from the city's economists about what they would anticipate that we would see. And what we did was we went further than that, particularly for our FY20 projections, to really reduce those parking tax revenues. And so we built from a much lower base when we anticipated an increase in rate. So we're certainly not assuming that we'll get 100% of, if we just increase the rate and assume the same base. And so we did adjust our revenue assumptions for all the different levers that are in play right now.
Thanks. Frank, do you want to talk about what we're doing on the collection side?
Sure. First, Councilwoman, I just want to apologize for the delay on that data request, but you will have that information today. It just took us a little longer to get it together, and we'll have that out to you. In terms of the collection strategy, we're watching things closely. We know that small businesses are really challenged through this time. Most of our focus right now has been on really bringing services back up within the revenue department so that we're there to hear the concerns of taxpayers and be able to work with them. It's early, so in this pandemic, and we know things are going to continue to evolve and businesses are going to be challenged. Our collection strategy is going to have to be similar. It's going to have to continue to evolve as we learn what the needs of businesses are and how they've been affected. We're working on new payment agreement terms that are specifically for COVID-affected businesses, which will give them the ability which we hope will give them the ability to get back into compliance in a relatively short term with no interest or penalty. And then for those that need longer term payment agreements, we'll look for beneficial terms for those too. So really, we want to be in a situation where we're there to listen to taxpayers, to hear what they need, what they can afford, and what is reasonable for them to be able to go on as a going concern. And to get back into compliance. We realize this is something that businesses had no way to plan for. There was no intent here not to pay their taxes, and we want to do what we can and be a partner to help them stay in business and get back into compliance.
Thank you. I heard the bell. I think one of the things that I'm going to expect as we finalize this budget is it's a little bit more direct, intentional, transparent process around what are we going to waive, what penalties are not going to be in place. I mean, we have to change the collection strategy, and people need to make decisions about whether they're going to open, and knowing that is a calculation, access to monthly payments, some sort of UPA plan for small businesses. We're going to have to do all of those plus. And I think to the extent that we're projecting them out and we can tell people that, it's going to help people have a little bit more confidence in the market and coming back and knowing that they can manage monthly expenses. So we'll continue to talk about that. I look forward to the data and then having a broader conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Chair recognizes Councilwoman Gauthier.
Thank you, Council President. Good morning, Mr. DeBow. I support increasing the local contribution to the school district this year, but I don't believe we should be placing the burden of this increased contribution solely on residents who are already severely financially under-resourced. And so I wanted to know if in coming up with this budget, did the city also consider temporarily raising other taxes such as the gross receipts tax and using the increased revenue to make a one-time contribution to the school district?
We did look at all of our revenue sources in figuring out how to balance the budget and to provide support for the school district. On the gross receipts report, on the BERT specifically, as part of our plan, we've frozen reductions. So we're generating additional revenue from the BERT over the course of the plan, but that money's staying with the city.
But would we be able to spread more of this burden out, and would we be able to decide to make to devote the increase to the school district?
If we decided to do that, it would mean looking for more cuts on the city side, because that's revenue that we counted towards balancing the city's budget.
Even if we increased the rate?
Well, if we increased the rate, right, then that would generate more money, but we would also be then putting an additional burden on our businesses who are also suffering because of what's going on with COVID-19. So that was one of the trade-offs that we considered. It's, as with all these things, I think there are conversations about all of them. When we looked at the pros and cons, we thought that winding up with eliminating the reduction made more sense than increasing the rate.
Our homeowners, many of whom are working class, are also struggling through this crisis. And so I'm just wondering about spreading more of the burden, particularly if we could protect smaller businesses from the increase, maybe by increasing the exemption as well.
So smaller businesses are protected in that the first 100,000 is already exempted. Homeowners with lower valued properties are also protected because of the homestead, and seniors are protected because of the senior freeze. So there are relief measures on various taxes too.
Thank you. My second question, can you explain the rationale for setting aside $20 million in the proposed budget for a rainy day? Should these funds be used to help the most vulnerable people now during a time of extreme economic hardship that is sure to continue into the coming fiscal year?
Yeah, so the reason that we left that there, and we've greatly reduced the amount that was there. It was in the 50s before. We took it down to 20 million. The reason we left that 20 million is the uncertainty around where the economy is going to go and what will happen with COVID-19. So we're really worried that things could get worse, and that if we didn't have a cushion, when things turn down, we could really be hurt. So it was really to provide a cushion against the uncertainty of the current pandemic.
Is this a place where we could, is the city flexible on this? And is this a place where we could potentially look for, a way to further fill our budget gap?
I think we should be open to discussing everything. I'd be concerned about getting rid of this until we had a better sense of the course of the pandemic, but we should discuss everything.
Thank you.
Good, Councilwoman?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Chair recognizes Councilman Jones.
Thank you, Mr. President. First and foremost, I recognize that we are, again, building a plane while we're attempting to fly it. And this is very difficult to do. But Mad River on Main Street closed its doors for good the other day. Made headlines, and it was a sad day. That was a 12-year business, which in aging of a small business is like aging in dog years. You survive the first 3 years, the second 3 years, it's like a miracle. But more and more small businesses along commercial corridors are failing. And as we look at this phenomenon, I'm wondering how this impacts our projected revenues, our projected taxation, And more importantly, leading to the question, who is in charge of the reopening of our economy here in Philadelphia? And who is working with the various departments and small businesses to anticipate the day when the governor turns our section of the Commonwealth like open for business? And so who's providing that guidance to small restaurant owners on proper social distancing, on where permits for the new norm will be, and how we can apply possibly for innovations like dining on closed streets. So I'm wondering if, as we someday, and I pray every night about us moving out of the crisis into the reestablishment of an economy. And here's why. All your projections you're giving us today won't matter if we fail. All of the anticipated revenues, the borrowings, none of that will matter if the Mad Rivers of the world, if the businesses that employ most of the workers that my colleagues Brooks and Jamie fight for, and Isaiah fight for, and Kathy fight for every day, none of that matters if we don't get that right. So in our finance projections, are we anticipating the reopening, and who's in charge, who's driving that train?
So in terms of who's driving that train, we have a group that includes managing director, mayor's chief of staff, health commissioner, the Office of Emergency Management, the Health and Human Services folks. So we have a group that meets every day to talk about kind of where we think the pandemic is going and what that means in terms of our ability to open up. In terms of our projections, I'll turn that over to Marissa so she can talk about how we built that in.
Hi, thank you. So yeah, we worked with IHS Markit, which is a global economic consulting firm, to look at sort of where we are, where we think we're going, which unfortunately is down, and then coming back up. And so the economic projections don't have a date in which we are just entirely open or entirely closed, but assume more of an incremental change. And so some of the stuff we're looking at is trying to understand and constantly looking at, honestly, our ongoing collection rates for some of our taxes.
So let me stop you, because the council president will gong me on my time.
Okay.
So I want to get to, I don't need the macro view of what Donald Trump is saying or what even the governor is saying. I need to know what L&I is saying and rewriting regs by which social distancing and street seating can be at least anticipated, so that a small business says, I need to buy these many tables. In the health department, who's going to come into the kitchen and say, your fry cook and your baker are physically too close. They need to be X amount of feet apart. There needs to be a plastic shield here, so that not only do small businesses get docked and dinged by us by a forced closing, but you need to think about forgiveness on interest and penalties, right? Because we forced them to close, right? But also, how do I, in the new norm, open safely so that I don't infect the entire world based on trying to get Council President a burger? Because he's big on his burgers. And he's mastered the art of opening the trunk, put it in, and pull off. But there has to be regulations designed around this. There has to be standards for OSHA designed around this. And we don't have to wait until we get the memo from Trump to start working on this. And I would like that information provided to the president and council members so that we can start to communicate that to some of the commercial corridors in the city of Philadelphia.
Got it. And just want to assure you that we are working on that, and we can get you information on it.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman. Chair recognizes Councilman O.
Thank you very much, Council President. Good morning. Not to anyone in particular, but it ends up usually being you, Rob, as you know. There's an estimate that revenues will be reduced in the amount of $553 million. And that's an estimate. And my question is, in that estimate, has there been, what have the projections been based on incentivizing new revenues? In other words, some of the policies and practices that you're implementing to cover the gap, how much of that has been dedicated to encouraging jobs, return to business, startup businesses, employers bringing their workforce back to the city?
So we have dedicated funding really to recovery. I think when Commerce comes on for their part of the testimony, they can give you more details on exactly what they're doing, but there is money set aside for them to do that.
My concern, obviously it's a concern, is that you have to balance the budget. I understand that. But these are estimates that are being made, and it seems as though there's also a commitment from the administration to not let go of its prized projects. It wants to move ahead. And there has been another idea that has been discussed, and I'm sure you discussed it among yourselves, and that is that after a pandemic, an emergency that is unprecedented, it's a good idea to settle, to stabilize, and to assess what has been damaged, which is jobs and revenues. And things like raising taxes on people who are already working outside of the city, who really aren't incentivized to come back into the city, even when the governor lifts, the restraints. Restaurants are very limited in how they're going to open, how they're going to serve. All of these type of things suggest that there needs to be an incentive to encourage new jobs, return to work. One of the biggest things about the city is arts and culture, tourism, conventions, people, even our universities. I mean, two things, eds and meds, arts and culture. You've zeroed out arts and culture. And I'm really questioning who comes into this city. I mean, people come in here to live. They choose to live in Philadelphia as opposed to New York or LA or New Orleans because of the arts and culture. Students choose to come to University Penn or Drexel or Temple because of the environment, because of jobs, job opportunities. It feels to me as though the emphasis of this plan is to fund the STAR programs of the administration, including rebuild. Could you answer that?
Yep. So the emphasis of the plan was to fund things that were related to public safety, health, and education. We had to make a lot of choices that we didn't want to make because we just didn't have revenue. For the projects funded by the beverage tax you're alluding to, what we did with those is freeze them at the 20 spending level. So we didn't do the continued expansion that we had initially budgeted. We didn't want to cut back on those because we didn't want to eliminate services there that were already provided. But we did freeze them. We wanted to make sure, that our public safety departments didn't take too large a cuts. Wanted to make sure that health was still funded and that education was funded. And we didn't have a lot of room. I mean, we had to close a $650 million gap. So we had to do things we wouldn't have wanted to do.
Thank you very much. I yield my time.
Thank you, Councilman. Chair recognizes Councilwoman Gilmore Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you so much for your testimony. I just wanted to echo the sentiments of my colleagues around the messaging that increased taxes would mean for our city's economy in the short and long term. We are already the poorest, largest city in America, and we'll need to do a lot more to help people during this recovery. Other cities and states have developed recovery councils to bring together leaders from diverse industries, both public and private sector, business, community, and nonprofit partners. Have you considered developing some type of council or committee to offer recommendations around our city's budget and our priorities that are long-term and thinking and looking ahead? Rob, I know you gave a detailed list of excellent government leaders who are around the table helping to make some of these decisions, but I think we can all benefit from a diverse group of individuals sitting at the table offering up recommendations to move our city forward that are also outside of government. So can you talk about your thoughts around developing or establishing that type of committee or council for Philadelphia?
Yeah, Commerce has actually been working with the Chamber and PIDC on that, and so I'll let Sylvie talk about that right now.
Here I come. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sylvie Gallia-Howard, Acting Commerce Director. So the Commerce Department is working closely with PIDC, Philadelphia Works, and the Chamber of Commerce on establishing an economic recovery task force or steering committee, something of that sort that would basically do a regional approach in terms of kind of rebooting and recovery for the region. And then we will also be doing a localized effort in terms of small business strategy and workforce strategy for the city to meet the needs of the most vulnerable.
Okay, and will that include leaders from both inside and outside of government?
Oh yeah, it'll be mostly business owners and leaders of the private sector, yep.
Okay, thank you. And then my next question is centered around, and I just want to thank my colleague, Councilwoman Sanchez, for talking about the need to assist small businesses as we move forward, but wanted to know if there were any additional plans around extending the Small Business Relief Fund, particularly for businesses that have gross receipts of $1 million or less, particularly those businesses who were not eligible or could not receive the Paycheck Protection Program.
I'll take that one as well. So we do have $3 million set aside that was initially for the Quality Jobs Program from a prior year allocation that we intend to use for small business relief. We're not sure yet if we will use that in exactly the same mechanism as we did for the last the Small Business Relief Fund, or if we'll do more targeted approach and potentially, for example, do it one program for restaurants or one program for some, nail salons, or, potentially target a little bit more. So we want to be really thoughtful and strategic about how we deploy those dollars, because we did $13.3 million in the last round, and we have $3 million for the upcoming fiscal year, plus a little bit in CDBG, which I'm sure when I get into my testimony, I'm sure we'll talk about that more. But we do plan to provide supports to small businesses. We just don't have as many dollars as we did.
Okay, and particularly around for small businesses with rental assistance and eviction prevention for small businesses. I think we need to do more around ensuring that we can help them stay whole throughout this process. And also, we've been hearing a lot from barbers and beauty salon owners relative to their concern around being able to stay in our city. The next question I have is around finance. There was an increase in Class 100 by over $1 million for One Philly. So if you could give us an update on One Philly's implementation, if there are any city employees who are still experiencing payroll issues, and how many employees do we have on payment plans due to the One Philly overpayments?
Okay, I will give you a broad overview, and then I'll turn it over to Kat Lamb to give more details. So One Philly has largely stabilized. There are far fewer issues now than there were before. We did add positions in the finance budget for One Philly. Part of that is to offset a reduction in contracted employees in the in OIT, the Office of Innovation and Technology. So it's not a complete increase. It's a shift in employees from contract to city employees. Although that said, there is a net increase for us that will allow us to provide more support and to help with the transition to One Philly. I'll let Kat give you more details.
Hi, my name is Kat Lamb. I'm First Deputy for Finance. As Rob basically summarized it, so we went live last April, so we've been in the new system for over 12 months, and the payroll system is largely stabilized, and we are not seeing as many issues, nearly as many issues as we did when we first went live. Your question, I don't have the right now, but we can submit it. I don't have the data on the exact amount of overpayments and recovery right now, but we can follow up and get your office that data.
Sure. If you could just submit that information to our council president, and he'll disseminate it to myself and my colleagues. I'll come back on the second round. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Chair recognizes Councilwoman Gibb.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much, everybody. And just a quick note to my dear colleague, Council Member Gilmore Richardson, the eviction moratorium bill and the diversion program that were put into City Council a little earlier would cover small businesses with less than 100 employees as well. So we hope to get that underway and get some help to our small businesses so that they don't have to go through the same kind of cycle of eviction. They get time to get some assistance. For Rob, my question is, I know that no revenue generation that comes out of taxes is the most desirable, but has the city considered, like, for example, I don't think we use sunsetting provisions enough. Would the city be open to a sunset on the wage tax increase on non-residents if it could sunset within a certain time period, and then we could review whether it needed to continue after that?
I think that's something that's worth discussion. Actually, when the wage tax was first put in place in 1932, it had a sunset.
Yeah, I mean, I think like if part of the recognition is that we're in extraordinary times, the city has had an enormous, has enormous needs right now. We need to be supporting businesses. We need a functioning commerce department. We need robust eviction diversion programs. We need a commerce department that hasn't been cut in half. I think part of that is recognizing that there might be temporary increases on people who actually have jobs, recognizing that so many people have lost theirs. And I know, again, it's not ideal, but if you would be open to a sunset provision, maybe that could also be a conversation we can have internally, and then we can review whether that sunset would need to go away should the city budget balance out next year.
Yeah, I think it's worth discussing. I think one of the things we just have to keep in mind is just the uncertainty that we face. So we may talk about having a sunset provision, and then, if things get worse, we may say, okay, well, that really doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah. I also want to thank the administration for its focus in on education in the school district. As we know, austerity hits school districts amongst the hardest. Obviously, it hits us in city budgets, but it also like dramatically hits the the school district of Philadelphia, which, unlike every single other school district in the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, has no capacity to raise its own revenues. I wanted to talk about two things. One, I'll eventually get to some of the other discussions, but I want to talk about the parking authority money. So the school district got about $15 million, I assume, from the parking authority this year. Their fiscal year ended at the end of March, so they were not that dramatically impacted by the city shutdown order. But the city's projecting that the school district should receive $0 from the parking authority for next year. And again, I'm in a fair share kind of approach, right? Like everybody has to give, even if they can't give like everything or the most, people have to give. So my question is like, why are you projecting $0 for the school district? And I don't want you to answer that question based on a defense of the agency's budget. I want to ask it, why are you giving them a pass? Why are you taking them off the hook? Because, for example, the parking lot revenue assumes that over the next year, people will start to come back to a sense of, movement and mobility within the city, but you're not giving that same pass with a PPA. We assume that they'll go back to a sense of some semblance. For the school district to lose $15 million from the parking authority through a budgetary, a preemptive kind of pass on the parking authority's funds, and that agency hasn't been reviewed nearly enough with appropriate oversight and scrutiny. Why would you do that?
And it's not really giving them a pass. It's recognizing that they've really stopped enforcement, and we've agreed with that strategy so that the amount of revenue that will be generated from parking enforcement will be much lower than it was in other years. And we think that as a result of that, they won't hit the threshold at which revenue goes to the school district.
So I understand again, and I'm not going to belabor this point. I'm going to disagree with it, but you don't apply that same thing to the parking lot projections, for example. So parking lots assume that there'll be some return to normalcy. Do you have a timeline on normalcy for the PPA? I assume it would chart the same kind of projection as parking lots.
Right, and we're assuming that there's a decrease in revenue from parking. And we're also assuming in the parking tax, and we're assuming it on the street parking side too. It's just that on the street parking side, it means that decrease keeps the parking authority below the level at which money goes to the district.
Yep, and I understand that there's a decrease, but you zeroed them out. And I think there's a difference between going from $15 million to say like $10 million, but $15 million to zero doesn't seem to be a fair projection. And I think it sends the wrong message on an entity where, again, we're all pushing on very hard decisions right now. And we got to ask the same of sister agencies that serve the school district of Philadelphia as well as the public interest. So I'm going to end there. Just one last comment very briefly. I think we should be clear that 29% of the district's entire budget relies on property taxes. And that is a difficult thing, but the entire one-third, almost a third of the district's budget relies on property taxes. So I want to be thoughtful about how to talk about taxation, not as just a means of money, taxing, but as a means of school funding. So my assumption is that the $30 million that you're pushing over to the school district, that money is coming directly from the proposal to moderately increase property taxes, which is 4% on 55% of someone's tax. So that's less than 2% or 2.2% of something. And while I'm not saying that that's like a necessity, can you just clarify that? Do you have other options?
Councilwoman.
Yes.
That's a question. You said you had a comment.
I did. I just asked the question, like, are there other options?
No, I'm saying you said you had a comment. The bell is wrong.
Okay.
And you said you had a comment.
I will pick that up on my
Everybody's
second round.
really being cognizant of the time. So
Yep. I will pick that up on my second round. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Chair recognizes Councilwoman Bass.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. I just have a couple of questions, and I did want to follow up on Councilwoman Gim's conversation around sunset provisions, because I think that's something, again, I think that is a tool that we really just don't utilize nearly enough. And so we need to, because we have no idea what's going to happen with the coronavirus pandemic. So we have no idea, what way the economy is going. Is it going to come back very quickly, very strongly, very robustly, or is it going to do the opposite? And so not having, some level of a sunset provision, I think, is a bit of a missed opportunity. So I'm hopeful that the administration will take a second look there and where possible, implement such provisions. Because we just, we can't go back to the city we had. And, it was great for some people and it was not so great for a lot of people. And what we need to do is we have to move the city forward to what we all want and what we all need. And so with that being said, Mr. Dubois, I have a question for you about over the last 5 years, we've had the city has operated, with projections of one amount and, it ends up that the actual balance and the fund balance, the general fund balance, has been significantly higher to the tune of over about $300 million over the last few years. Can you give us some sort of sense of how we have spent those surplus dollars? Because what I find is that we continue to just forge ahead. We just move forward and we don't look back and we say, well, exactly where were those resources allocated?
Right. So there were a number of places where we saw increases in spending and investments over the last 4 or 5 years. One of the things we did was build up our fund balance, which got up at the end of last year to over $400 million. That's proving to be really helpful now as we face this recession, because the first thing we're able to do is draw on those reserves to help mitigate the impact of the cuts and revenue increases we needed. We've also put substantially more money into pensions over time, which has addressed a long-standing issue that was crucially important for our fiscal health. The school district contribution has increased dramatically over time, so that's been another area where we've seen additional investment as a result of revenues being stronger than we initially anticipated. We did some pay-as-you-go capital when revenue came in stronger than anticipated. That helped us avoid issuing more debt, which then helps reduce our fixed cost. So those are some of the kind of high-level areas where when revenue came in higher than we thought, what we did with the money.
So it will be helpful if you could provide to the council president, to the chair, some sort of detail in writing so that we could get a glimpse of exactly where these resources went to, because I think it's important for the public to get a sense of how money has been spent and where money has gone, because they've heard over and over and over again that there have been these surpluses, and the question that I'm getting a lot now is, where's that money? Where did it go? What happened to it? And so if we're able to detail that, I think it will be really helpful for everyone to see. So,
okay, thank you.
Okay, great. And another question is, I also wanted to follow up on tax amnesty. That's a question that we had considered, and we had a hearing on that, over a year ago. And, now that we are in a time of crisis, I'm wondering if that's something that the administration is willing to reconsider. That was something which was done under the Nutter administration when we were in economic crisis before. So I'm wondering, is this something that the administration is now willing to take a look at to hopefully have an infusion of cash here in the city of Philadelphia?
Yeah, when we and Commissioner Breslin can give more detail. When we looked back at the impact of that amnesty over a 3 or 4 year period, it wound up being really negative in terms of the impact it had on our collections. So we're really hesitant. And as I said before, we should discuss everything, but I do worry about an amnesty. But I'll let Commissioner Breslin give more detail on that.
Yes, hi. I think that really kind of sums up the position on amnesty. I mean, we did an analysis. We used it in the last recession. It did give us an infusion of cash that was much needed at that time. So it's certainly a good tool to have in the toolbox for recessionary times. I think in your opening statements, Councilwoman, you kind of said there's a lot of uncertainty right now, and I think that is true. We don't know how this economy is going to bounce back. We don't know how the plans for recovery are going to work. So, I mean, amnesty is something that is good to have in the toolbox. I always view it as a tool that we use of last resort because it does generate some cash flow if needed in a short period of time, but it does that at great expense. So that's what has to be weighed. And as Rob said, everything should be considered, and that is a tool that we have, but it has to be weighed carefully because of the costs of implementation of an amnesty program.
Well, I certainly understand. I have some more questions. I'll go to the next round, but I certainly understand the need to, to tread lightly and to think carefully about how we proceed. But if there was ever a time for a tax amnesty, now is the time. We are in such a quandary financially with all of our businesses here in the city of Philadelphia that if we can get some to maybe who owe us to maybe pony up so that we can have some resources in the bank and not tax our taxpayers, our homeowners who have been, in my opinion, taxed and taxed and taxed and taxed. If there's a way that we can do this without having additional real estate taxes, then I think that we certainly need to go that route instead. Mr. President, I'll hold my other questions till the next round.
Thank you, Councilwoman. We're going to start our second round. Chair recognizes Councilman Green. Councilman Green. Going once, twice, three times.
I'm here, Council Member.
Oh,
Council President. Because I need to switch my earpiece. Sorry about that.
Sure, no problem.
All right. Yes, I just wanted to follow up on some of the questions I'd asked earlier in reference to the issues we had regarding revenue and L&I. And Mr. President talked about that they communicate quite regularly. When you say communicate quite regularly, does that mean you're fully sharing information on all of the business privilege license accounts and tax accounts and doing some reconciliation of those accounts?
I'm going to let First Deputy Kathleen McColgan talk about the level of data sharing that we have with L&I.
Good morning, this is Kathleen McColgan. So yes, we do share data regularly with L&I. We have an interdepartmental cooperation and have regular meetings with them. We've instituted data sharing processes that inform our investigations and our auditing efforts. For example, in FY20, we've initiated 26 audits through referrals that have been sent to us by L&I and assessed over $629,000 as a result. We also partner with L&I in sharing data for our tax clearance process. Anyone seeking a permit or a license must be compliant with taxes. And in FY19, we collected over $8.4 million by requiring tax clearance. And although there's other processes that utilize tax clearance, that number's largely due to L&I business and data sharing with revenue.
So anytime someone opens a business privilege license and opens a tax account, that information is automatically shared between revenue and license inspection?
They have an interface with our data, and anytime someone is doing business with L&I, there's a clearance process to determine if that person is compliant with their taxes, if they have the appropriate tax accounts, and if not, they are unable to receive those licenses and permits, and they are referred to revenue to become tax compliant.
What about reconciliation if someone has multiple business privilege licenses and maybe one tax account? Are you doing a reconciliation and making sure that people are not making money through multiple accounts, but only reporting it through one tax account?
I think I might have to collect more data on that and get back to you.
Yeah, that's part of my understanding, my concern, that businesses have been doing business in a city under multiple licenses, but only using one tax account. And so they may be making money here in the city of Philadelphia, but only reporting it through one account. And that's some of the reconciliation concerns that I have that's not occurring.
Okay, we'll gather some information and respond back to you on that.
Okay. I want to go back to Mr. DeBow in reference to OPA. And in reference to, you said there we have an interim head of the Office of Property Assessment, someone that has a lot of experience and perspectives. In the work that IHS Global did regarding collections and projections under the new COVID-19 on this proposed tax increase, have assessments in reference to, let me rephrase, has it been factored into this process, the challenges we've had with assessments and collections and also reimbursements from appeals?
So I'll ask Marissa to answer that and how we built the appeals factor into our appeals and collection factors into our projections.
Hi, thank you. So what we did around the real estate tax, because we know that there's a lot of things happening there. One, will be carrying forward the prior year's assessments. So we knew we weren't going to see a lot of increase that folks were going to be appealing, but obviously because of current conditions, we thought there may be some amount of increased appeals because of changes in how much rent they're getting, things like that. And we also know that folks' ability to pay might also be impacted. Instead of, because of all of the uncertainty, trying to piece out how much is attributable to each piece of that to get to a total, what we did was do a 5% reduction overall in what we anticipate collecting to account for all of those different changes. And that 5% came from data provided by our outside economic consultants, IHS, around both changes in profits for businesses, in terms of changes for salaries and wages in the city and region. And so using that combined information that we thought would impact us, we just simply reduced the overall collections by 5% to account for all of the different impacts that are in play right now.
And this is my final question, because I think my time is up. And this goes back to some of the points that were said earlier. And I don't think I got a full perspective on the question regarding the fact that if you put into the budget, I believe, $650 million on the grants revenue for the possible revenue reimbursement, how does the administration plan on spending that, and how will they notify council of their desire to spend those dollars if that comes in the beginning of this new fiscal year and we've had to do some of these proposed cuts that you are asking for?
Yeah, so I think if that money does come in, if we get revenue replacement from federal government, we would look to redo this budget depending on the amount of revenue we got, and we would want to work with council during that process. We really, in our best case scenario, we get as close as possible to the version of the budget that we introduced back in March. But again, that's something we want to work with council on if we did get additional revenue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council President.
Thank you. We'll come back. I think it was a couple of members that I did not get on the first round. Councilman Heenan, are you teed back up? Councilman Heenan?
Yes, Council President. Thank you. I appreciate you allowing me to get back online here. So, good morning, colleagues, Council President, and I have a quick question for Rob DeBow. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning.
The question is more on the outlook of and tracking of the federal and state governments and their budgeting process, and more so in the timing of it. Specifically, if the state decides that it will have a continuing resolution, like if it's allowed to, a continuing resolution like the federal government in D.C., and they do a rebudget in the fall. Are we projecting any kind of additional resources that might come back to the city as a result of that? And the timing of that, when it relates to our budget here, are we able to go back in at a later time, like similarly to the state and the federal government?
Yeah, so one of the challenges we have every year in our budget process, even if the state doesn't do a continuing resolution, is they often finish up after we do. So we're at a disadvantage because we don't know exactly where funding will wind up. And this year, obviously, that's a particular challenge. That's one of the reasons that we put that $600 million into the unanticipated grants, so that if either the feds or the state provide us money after the fiscal year has begun, we have a way to spend it.
Right, and that makes sense. I'm just, trying to, talk about, making, this budget has been, it's drastically altered, right, and amended in the resubmittal. But do we need to continue to make drastic changes in new revenue streams in anticipation or not knowing if, there might be a rebudget and other grants through other sources, particularly again from the state or federal government? So I'm just wanted to talk about it publicly and, continue to have the conversation as this process goes forward.
Got it. Thanks.
Thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Councilman. Chair recognizes Councilman Thomas.
Good morning. Can you hear me clear, Council President?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. I want to jump right into it. I want to start with Councilmember Gim was speaking briefly about the $0 coming from the PPA to the School District of Philadelphia. I too just wanted to re-examine where that number came from. And I'm also wondering if there was any conversation with the PPA about not just the anticipated $0 amount, but any innovative ways that we can work with the PPA so they can generate more revenue, so they can make their normal contribution to the School District of Philadelphia.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the projection is that the parking authority revenue comes to the city first. If they surpass a threshold, then money goes to the school district. So we're not projecting zero overall from the parking authority. We are projecting that they won't exceed the threshold where money would go to the school district. I think that we've had some conversations with the parking authority about whether there are other ways to generate revenue. I don't think those are far enough along to be conclusive and include anything in a budget, but that is a conversation that we've had and will continue to have.
Thank you. I just find that interesting. Just as this chair of Streets and Services, I had a number of conversations with the folks at the parking authority, and my conversations with them were about revenue, and that was something because they know I'm very passionate about public education, as a lot of my colleagues are, and I'm sure the administration is as well too. But that was never something that they brought to my attention, and they never talked about not being able to completely recover. So I was, again, just wondering where those estimates came from as it relates to, was it dialogue with the administration? But in the sense of time, I'll just move on. You talked earlier about the federal bonds and the possibility of generating some revenue through federal bonds and borrowing on that level. I know that option is always out there, but I'm just wondering from the perspective of the administration, We understand that it's not the most fiscally responsible thing to do to borrow for operating costs. And it's definitely in the best interest to borrow for capital costs instead of operating costs. I'm just wondering, what narrative do we feel like it sends the city of Philadelphia when we have tons of businesses all across the city of Philadelphia who themselves are in a terrible fiscal position, and we're telling citizens and businesses that we will allow them to be in a bad financial status, but we ourselves as a municipality will not take that risk to avoid either tax increases or cutting programs or things like that. I'm wondering if there was any conversation or dialogue around redirecting dollars right now currently, and maybe having that federal bond or those dollars come in to possibly have that fund some type of capital investment and reallocate dollars that are already there so that those current dollars can deal with operating costs. I know that was a lot, but I really just wanted to see if that was a conversation that the administration had, and I'm, again, also really worried about the narrative.
Yeah, so, and Treasurer Dunbar can provide more information on this, but the federal money, the liquidity facility from the feds, is not about balancing budgets. It's only about smoothing out cash. So they're not doing anything to help replace lost revenue with that. It's only about helping you make cash payments during the year. So that is not something that would help us avoid any of the things that we had in our budget. But Kristen can give more detail.
So again, just for clarity, right? I'm pretty sure that we can all agree that earlier you testified that it would be a bad idea to borrow for operating costs. You didn't say that it would be impossible. You said it would be fiscally not in the best interest of the city. So I don't think that it's a good idea to now say that we can't borrow for operating costs.
Now, you had two separate things in your question. One was about the federal liquidity facility. So I wanted to answer that part. And then wanted to go back to the second part, which was why I don't think that a deficit borrowing makes sense. Anyway, Kristen, if you wanted to talk about the liquidity facility.
Certainly. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Councilman Thomas. As it relates to the liquidity facility, I think it's important to mention that the feds put the liquidity facility in place to ensure that the private market functioned, efficiently, and to also give municipalities an opportunity to borrow from the federal government in an event that they could not borrow from investors. And so the liquidity is in addition to what you can already do in the capital markets. Now, Rob alluded to earlier that we had not needed to borrow a TRAN or tax revenue anticipation note over the last several years because our cash position has been good. And so what the feds have done is that they put the liquidity in place in lieu of what happens in a private market. Now they set a price. And so what we will evaluate is the price in a private market versus the price the feds have set. Now, currently, if we were borrowing today, we would likely borrow in the private market and not use the federal liquidity facility because we would get a better price. And to Rob's larger point, that is just to smooth out our cash flow. Because we anticipate revenue typically at the middle and 3/4 of the fiscal year. So right at the middle or going into the middle of the fiscal year is where our cash flow is low. So historically, we have borrowed to smooth that out. We pay back within the fiscal year. That's a requirement in our bond indenture as it relates to our short-term borrowing needs. Now to your larger question, and I think we touched on this earlier in Rob's comments and in my comments, that investors as well as the rating agencies do not believe that's a best practice, and there's certainly a price to pay financially if we were to do so, and that price isn't just in the short term around individual borrowing, but if it triggers a negative rating action, that carries through to future borrowings for anything we want to do. And more specific to your question about reallocating line items in a budget, I mean, a majority of our capital spending is from borrowing. So that's what we typically do. We borrow for a large majority of our capital spending. We do have some pay-go capital, and Marissa can address that more specifically, I think, to your question.
Yeah, and one of the things we did in balancing the budget was move some of what had been pay-go into the operating budget. So we had been trying to reduce debt service in the long term by paying for capital out of operating. We unwound some of that as part of this balancing. And I do think part of the message you were talking about, what message are we sending, is that we need to, to get into balance, and we need to do it in a way that also doesn't threaten our long-term fiscal health.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council President. I know my time is up. I just want to close out by saying that I too look forward to seeing the poverty plan that is going to be sent to you as well. I am also concerned, like the rest of my colleagues, as it relates to the tax increases that's being recommended. And I'm anticipating that I probably won't get another opportunity to go a second round. So I would like to just ask the administration if they can to give us the amount of revenue that we've collected in the month of March, as well as the month of April, from the areas that they're recommending that we increase taxes. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Councilman. Chair recognizes Councilman Squilla. Councilman Squilla.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for your time, and thank you for everybody there testifying. And I know the challenge is as we talk about raising taxes and sunsetting them and things like that. And we know that, it's very hard once we have a tax in place to remove it or to sunset it. But when you were looking at these aspects, and I know we looked at our city assets as ways to look at them and see that if there's other ways to bring revenue into our budget beside the tax increases.
Yeah, so one of the things we look at, for example, is whether there are asset sales that could help generate revenue. So we do kind of look at any opportunity we have for generating revenue.
All right. Do you have any that you looked at per se in this budget process, or?
I think there are some projected sales, but I'm gonna refer to Marissa, who might know more of the detail.
Hi, yes. So some of our concerns are actually, we had already been planning for fairly significant capital asset sales for 20 and 21, and I can get back to you with the exact numbers and properties. But so on the one hand, we were looking at what we could maybe sell, and what then as a result actually we might not be able to due to the timing, due to just general uncertainty. And then were there any opportunities for new things that we could sell that we hadn't actually been planning to? We ran through a bunch of different things, like what if we sell this, what if we sell that? But obviously some things in the work include 500 South Broad Street, as well as the facility at 11th and Reed. So those are things that were already in play that we're continuing to look at and expect to see. We started kicking around some ideas, but also the Roundhouse. But we started kicking around some ideas of what might also happen and talk to different folks throughout the administration. We didn't feel it was appropriate to, given the sort of 3-week turnaround in doing this, figure out, okay, what could we put on the market that we hadn't planned to and get a good price for that it makes sense in the long term. So we didn't build in any new sales, and we're carefully looking at the existing properties. Also forgot to mention the medical examiner, which I think we already have a facility that will be moving into 400 North Broad. So we have a number of transactions that are in play that we're monitoring that we had been expecting dollars from, that we hope to continue to. There was nothing new that we thought that in the short term on top of that made sense to quickly put onto the market.
All right, but you are open to that in a way to gain revenue to the city?
Yes, we are.
All right, that's something we could look at also then as council as we progress forward through the budget process. And Rob, and maybe whoever, but with OPA, and I know you guys have had a rate increase proposal this budget season, which I'm not in support of, but I understand. Do you know that will there be an assessment increase at all looking at next year moving forward?
So for the upcoming year, we moved values forward. So there's no 21 assessment increase for FY22 tax year 22. We will be going through an assessment process and there'll be changes in values as a result of that process.
Right, so whatever rate increase that you propose this year will be then capitalized by the increase in assessments the following year, correct?
Assuming there are increases, it depends on where the market is.
Right, and you have your new CAMA system that's supposedly helping determine those things, correct?
New CAMA system and an outside auditor who will monitor the process as we go through it and make suggestions for improvements.
Okay, because that also, I mean, is going to be a challenge moving forward. As we know, we're looking at this year, and obviously we don't have any plans to really judge our revenue stream depending on how we restart the economy. Next year is going to be just as difficult, and to have that burden on them too is like doubling a burden if we have a rate increase with a assessment increase the following year. That's just my thoughts, and that makes it more of a challenge. Thank you.
Good.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilman. I got a couple of questions. I guess that would be for you, Rob. In the reserves component of your budget, in the recession reserve, it's actually 50 million, and you had 30 million for unreimbursable COVID-19 costs. Do you have a sense that there will not be any reimbursables as it relates to what our expenditures are, or would it make sense for us to know that prior to the expenditure?
Yeah. So under the CARES Act, reimbursements are for costs incurred by the end of this calendar year.
Yeah.
And we're assuming that there will be costs that we incur in the second half of the year. And that 30 million is an estimate of what those costs would be, but they could be things like testing or contact tracing. So we think that there will still continue to be costs. It's one of the things that we would hope eventually happens with federal government is that they allow us to get reimbursed for costs that are incurred after the end of the year.
So it's likely that we will have that 30 mil available.
Only if the federal government changes that deadline. If they don't, we would not. We would have to spend money in the second half of the fiscal year.
So in future CARES, let's say the CARES Act that they're working on now.
Heroes.
I'm sorry. It's getting hard to keep up with these names.
Yeah.
Money for states and municipalities is supposed to be the focus of that particular legislation. Do you think that there would not be money available for the city of Philadelphia in that particular version?
I think if the HEROES Act passes, I think there will be additional funds for the city. And it goes back to the question I think that Councilman Green asked. I think then we would have an opportunity to go back and make changes to the budget that would make, we'd be able to look at the cuts we've made, look at the tax bills we make, and see what kind of changes we'd want to make.
So but
we're not there yet, and there's no guarantee that it'll pass or that it will look anything like it does now if it does pass.
All right, let me be clear. I just want to get clarity on the 30 million for the unreimbursable COVID-19 costs. That would be prior to subsequent to the deadline established for the expenditure of those dollars. What exactly would those be? Or what do you anticipate the use for those funds being for?
So the reason we put them in the reserve is we're not 100% sure yet. It could be things like contract tracing or testing, but before we spent anything, we'd have to transfer it out of the reserve. And so we'd have to go through a process with council where we showed you how it would be spent.
So you don't think that we'll receive funding for contact tracing and testing? I'm just trying to get an understanding on why these will be able to.
Well, because so far we haven't gotten anything that reimburses expenditures beyond December 30th. And so when we put the budget together, we're limited by what's actually out there.
Okay.
And there's still Republicans pushing back on the idea of doing anything soon or pushing back on providing money to state and local governments. So I don't think we can assume that it will happen. I mean, we hope that it does, and if it does, then we should come back and make changes. But I don't think we can do it until there's more definity around what will happen.
All right. And we'll have no ability to raise additional revenue after July 1 because
that's correct.
Taxation. All right. That's the real reason. All right. Okay. All right. I understand that. In the labor reserve, the $6 million, we dealt with 33 for that. District Council.
Correct. So the budget, we hit the budget to bed before the 33 agreement was reached. So we left an amount in reserve in case we reach an agreement, and we did. So that will pay for the 33 deal.
Okay. Now, I know this has been addressed. Just want to get you on the record as the finance director of the Housing Trust Fund. It does not include a general fund appropriation. I know it's been discussed. You anticipate having a conversation with us about that because of the possibility of any CDBG dollars not being available or having the level of flexibility that we anticipated.
That's correct. Yes, correct. And we did in the plan put that money back in, started putting money in again in 22. So that was a 1-year change.
Well, I mean, it's 1 year. A lot can happen in 1 year.
That's definitely true.
All right, I'm good. I'll come back. Chair recognizes Councilman Dom. Councilman Dom. Okay. That'll happen.
Yes, if you go to Parker.
Unmute, Prez. Unmute. Can you hear me? Okay. I think are you telling me to go here, Prez?
I'm begging you to please go ahead.
Okay, all right. I did hear you. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Sylvie Galler from the Commerce Department if she could get teed up. And Sylvie, I need to get a tremendous amount of information on the record in the midst of my time. So I'm going to ask you if you can be as brief as possible with these questions. I want to start, yesterday we heard Councilman Squilla refer to a smart restart and reopening our economy. Obviously, as we await state regs, and then we, the city, will establish regs. The Commerce Department is going to be extremely important to that effort. And as when Councilman Jones was questioning the department about its future plans, I think we should delve a little deeper into that. So one, I want to know, tell me how much has been cut from Commerce's budget. This is extremely important to know, and I just want to answer from a percentage perspective and then give me an absolute dollar monetary amount. How much has been cut from Commerce from a percentage and then a dollar amount?
Okay, sure. Yes, Councilwoman. So we are basically about 50% of the general fund allocation has been cut between what was proposed in the last iteration of the budget, about a month ago, and what is in there today.
Wait. Did you just say a 50% cut?
Yes, just about a 50% cut.
Okay.
We were going to have approximately $10.7 million for FY21, and now we're scheduled to have approximately $5.4 million.
5.4
in general fund.
Now, related to that, tell me how many Commerce Department employees out of your total number of employees will you have to lay off? And this is important because you're going to be the lead department to help to get our economy back up and running. So I'm thinking about manpower.
Sure. So, what I'll say is that we're going to be short 18 staff between vacancies and layoffs. I'd rather not get into the specifics of layoffs because that's still in process and out of respect to my colleagues. But we're going to be down 18 staff, so about 30% fewer staff.
30%.
And that's before adding the workforce staff. We'll have five workforce staff that are being consolidated from the Office of Workforce Development coming into our department.
Now, the last budgetary question regarding the department I want to ask is, you mentioned a 50% cut. With what you have been appropriated, tell me how many of those dollars are pass-through dollars. I mean, last year, you'll remember during the budget process, I talked about Commerce being a vehicle for pass-through dollars. I don't care if we were talking about what was the convention center or anything else. Tell me what dollar amount is attributed to the pass-through process in which Commerce is a vehicle.
So every year we have a $15 million payment that goes to the convention center debt that goes through the Commerce Department. And all the hotel tax dollars also pass through the Commerce Department. Obviously, that varies every year. I think it was about $70-80 million last year. It's going to be a lot lower, but that all just passes through. We don't touch any of those dollars. So, and aviation is also part of our budget. So the actual core operating budget that we receive in general fund allocation, it's typically in the 9 million number, and it'll be 5.4 this year.
Okay.
Now we will have additional one-time CDBG to help us out this year, assuming that gets passed by council. And
listen, we'll have to make sure we keep that in mind. But I needed to just get a snapshot of what that looked like as we get through this budget process. Now I want to go back to what Councilman Jones mentioned. We also heard Councilwoman Sanchez and Gilmore Richardson when they were talking about small business and neighborhood commercial quarters. They are literally looking to us for guidance. Although we know that the stay-at-home order is in existence for Philadelphia until June the 4th, we're waiting for more direction from the federal government. Has the Commerce Department begun to develop what it will call sort of an economic recovery plan that our neighborhood businesses can look to for guidance? And let me give you an example. And just for the record, I'm going to circulate this to all of my colleagues now, and I also forward it to you. It's from the city of Tampa, and I know there are only 400,000 people there, but it's a great snapshot of the level of detail that we heard Councilman Jones mention in his line of questioning relative to, listen, temporary use of the sidewalks. When you hear Councilman Don talk about the struggling restaurant industry, as we think about our neighborhood-based businesses, enabling temporary use of on-street parking, mandatory covering of faces, the social distancing, fire safety, L&I, penalties for non-compliance. Those are all of the kinds of things that we are hearing from a grassroots level from businesses saying, listen, we're trying to prepare to get ready for opening, and we need guidance from the city. So when you talked about, and I'll leave with this, when you talked about that task force working with the chamber and PIDC that Councilwoman Gilmore Richardson so aptly mentioned, and although we know the supports that are available right now for the businesses, I know she doesn't need an education about that because she's been educating people about that. But when you hear her mention that, what she is mentioning is that we have to make sure that there's a diverse group at the table. So when we're talking about neighborhood-based businesses, make sure that the ethnic chambers, you mentioned chamber, but the ethnic chambers must be involved. When we talk about businesses, all sizes, the barbershops, the neighborhood retailers, and you guys have done a yeoman's job with everything you've done. In superhuman speed, you've gotten it done and pretty, efficient. So I want to commend you, but I want you to just put in context what Councilwoman Gilmore was mentioning with that task force and what our businesses are looking for from us, from a guidance perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Councilman. Totally agree. So we have been pivoting everything to respond to the crisis, and the way we're thinking about our economic strategy, we are frankly still formulating it, but it's really targeted around 4 R's: respond, restart, recharge, and reimagine. And we're looking at everything differently because we know we'll never go back to where we were before, but we do think there's opportunities to reimagine what the city can be and to be more equitable. And we're even looking at our current programs and how we can pivot them, to be more related to PPE equipment for our small businesses, or delivery windows, or technology, and being able to have the capacity to do online or delivery, those types of things. So we will be, we absolutely, diversity is totally a priority, working with the chamber. They've heard that from me a lot. They know that that's very, very important. And that'll be the regional sort of sector strategy for the region. And then we will have local City of Philadelphia response plan for workforce. We're working on that with Philadelphia Works, and with PIDC, we have a consultant already in place because we'd already put out an RFP for a study for entrepreneurs of color, women, and immigrants, and that is pivoting right now to COVID in addition to a longer-term strategy.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Next up, we have Councilwoman Brooks. Oh, you know what, Councilwoman? Hold on one second. Councilman Dom was disconnected earlier. And let me get Councilman Dom and then Councilwoman Brooks after Councilman Dom, you back on?
Yeah, I am. Thanks, Council President. So I'm assuming that nothing was heard before, so I'll just start over. But when looking at the budget and the spending, I just want to point out that it seems like over the last 4 years, even with the revised budget, we've increased the budget by 22%. Against the backdrop of inflation in that 4-year period of 5%. And I think the residents and the people in the city are feeling that. It's like we're spending above our means. And when we did the wage tax bill, we found research that showed of the top 50 cities in the United States, Philadelphia taxed local taxes the highest at 18.1% of people earning under $30,000, while everyone else was typically between 7 and 13. And it concerns me to put more taxes on that population. But based on that, this might be a question for revenue. It looks like you're cutting out all funding for the earned income tax credit and taxpayer assistance programs. And in February, as you know, the council passed the wage tax refund bill to put money back in the hands of those who need it most. How does the cut to taxpayer assistance programs affect the people's ability to get their wage tax refund? Number one. Number two, how much do you anticipate refunding this year? And number three, does this cut affect your capabilities to process applications?
Just before Commissioner gets to that, I would want to just make a couple of points about the first two things you said. One, you talked about the increase in spending, and as we've talked about, the biggest portions of that increase were increasing our pension contribution, increasing our contribution to the school district, an increase in our benefits costs, the pre-K and community schools costs. And these are all things that we're not invested in for years and years, and that we're making up for years of underinvestment. But with that, I'll let Commissioner talk about your specific question.
I figured that was going to be your answer, by the way. Okay.
I know we've had this discussion a few times.
Yes, Councilman. So we did do significant decreases in our budget cuts to our earned income tax credit outreach and the funding of that, and that, you know, this, as has been said, this is, you know, a tough time where you're making painful decisions, and as you know, we're a staunch supporter of the Earned Income Tax Credit program, but that program is not a core service of the Department of Revenue. That is a federal tax program. There's a lot of partners that try to get the word out. So in having to take these tough cuts, that is why we took the cut there. You know, and it is painful for us to do that. But, and we also took a smaller cut, but we took a cut to other outreach services. As you know, and council knows, that revenue has been very active in all the council districts and doing hundreds of in-person events and outreach events. And as has been said many times, this is really a changing situation. So we don't know what outreach will look like in the future. We're just going to have to be versatile and maybe change the way we do some of our outreach, but we still intend to touch as many Philadelphians virtually now, I guess, instead of, you know, the in-person ways we did before. But we intend to do as much as we can with outreach. As far as the wage tax refunds, I don't think this will have an impact on the amount or numbers of refunds. We'll still do outreach about that in ways that we can, and a lot of that has been virtual. You know, I've talked before, I don't want to take up a lot of time, but we've talked about our communications team. We have, they're excellent. They have used social media, Facebook Live events. That doesn't reach everyone, and we understand that. So we're just going to have to, as I talked earlier about a collection strategy, and we will put one together that we hope is very effective. We're going to put together a communication strategy as well that will be, you know, be very effective, but also be appropriate for, you know, for the times we're in right now. And as far as a number, I don't have an estimate here. We can get back to you with that, of what we anticipate the dollar amount of those refunds being.
Okay. The other. I mean, overall though, this is my issue. There are cuts to the budget that actually produce very positive returns. Many of our providers that we provide $1 to get back $10, $12, $13 in EITC federal money back into the pockets of Philadelphians. And I just wonder if that analysis was done on these cuts as to what the returns are of each cut to determine if that's really a smart move by us.
Right. And I think, okay.
No, go ahead, Frank. It's okay.
I was just going to say, we looked at it in terms of, you know, it's a significant amount of money. And if we had to take cuts in other ways, I think it would undercut our core services, and those core services are going to be needed more now through this pandemic than ever before. So we really hesitated to cut any of those core services. We know that taxpayers are going to need relief, and they're going to need payment agreements. They're going to need services from the Department of Revenue like never before, and we want to be prepared to deliver those services. And as much as we believe in earned income tax credit, it is not a core service of the department, and we didn't want to have to cut our core services.
Okay, I think my time's up, so I'll come back again, but thank you very much. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Councilman. And before I call on Councilwoman Brooks, Mr. President, thank you. It may not be a core service to your particular department, but the fact that we would not put in place a method that would allow us to literally get tens of millions of dollars into taxpayers' hands at today's times, given the challenges, as you referenced, federal dollars that are not coming out of our general fund, is beyond me. So it may not be in your department, but we're probably going to insist that it be somewhere within the administration or have some private sector entity provide the assistance to make sure that we get this money in taxpayers' hands. Thank you. Chair recognizes Councilwoman Brooks.
Thank you, Council President. One of my questions is the city had a personal property tax in the late 1990s. Did the administration consider reinstating the personal property tax, which is a progressive tax that taxes folks who own stocks and other assets? And I have some more specific questions, but I'll send that along in writing.
I think there was a legal challenge to that tax. I may be wrong about that, but let us get back to you about why that went away, unless Commissioner President or someone in Revenue knows more detail about that.
Yeah, we can get back to you with the details. It was declared unconstitutional, I believe, in Montgomery County. There was a case. We'll get back to you with the details of the case. And at that time, the city of Philadelphia had to stop instituting that tax. But we'll get back to you with the details.
Okay, and another one, we're on commerce now. Another one of your goals for FY21 is to launch a $2 million loan program to help CDCs buy real estate on commercial corridors and reduce displacement of long-term business owners. And I know this is an important task, and I wanted to make sure that you're thoughtful about how these funds are allocated. So I was wondering, how did you go about selecting the CDCs, and in which areas of the city receive these funds? And how will the amount of funding be determined for these loans, and what are the terms of the loan?
Thank you, Councilman. I'm going to actually turn over to Karen Fegley.
Hello, good morning, almost afternoon, City Council. This is Karen Fegley, Deputy Commerce Director. Thank you for that question. We have created we have set aside, we realized there was a need for more local control of properties, especially in areas that were changing, and we wanted to retain the opportunities for small business owners to continue to operate, and for community development corporations with best interests in mind to make sure that they were maintaining these key properties in their neighborhoods. The fund we created is actually the RFP we put out was to establish a fund. So we put out an RFP to select a community development financial institution who would run the loan fund. So the exact terms and amounts and recipients have not yet been determined. Though that will be on the program will be developed and those funds will be provided on case-by-case opportunity. But it certainly will go to, it's CDBG funds. It will certainly go targeted mostly to low and moderate income communities. And again, the priority is to purchase and control key real estate, especially in commercial corridors, but just where there's opportunity for it to really have an impact on the neighborhood and for it to continue to provide places for businesses to operate and goods and services to be made available to the communities.
Thank you. I have another question about the quality jobs programs. In fiscal year 21, strategic goals is to launch a quality jobs program which offers business grants, and they create quality jobs. And I wasn't clear about the testimony. Will this program be happening in fiscal year 21? And if it will be changed? And can you explain how are you defining quality jobs in terms of salaries, benefits, and workplace protection? Are the employers required to hire people who live in Philadelphia for them to receive these grants? What are some of the other reasons or the other parts of the fund? And how much will you spend on this program?
So I actually haven't updated testimony but it seems like we're not probably gonna have time for that. I'm not sure. So that was the previous testimony that was submitted. It's not the updated testimony. So the Quality Jobs program actually is completely being repivoted. to address the needs of small businesses and retaining jobs and preserving businesses. So we actually, that was part of what we used in terms of funding the Small Business Relief Fund. We used $5 million of that fund, and we intend to use $3 million of that for the next fiscal year. So it will be really focused on targeted initiatives around supporting small businesses, really the hardest hit businesses, and trying to preserve jobs through that effort. So it really won't be the same program that we had thought of during the good times.
Okay, well, I have some questions about the small businesses that applied that were qualified but did not receive any funding. Is Commerce giving any special consideration to those small business owners within the eligible improvement conditions and empowerment zones to receive those grants in the future, and has an analysis of the unallocated money with the considerations of being allocated and directed for immediate access to 100% forgivable loans, which prior to COVID was receiving funding through the Community Lending Partners Business Improvement Grants that are currently being funded?
I'm not sure if I caught all of that, but in terms of the Small Business Relief Fund, we are doing a thorough analysis, both of all of the businesses that received it, which is a little bit over 2,000, and the businesses that did not receive it, which was approximately 5,000 businesses. So we are going to look at the reasons why those businesses were declined and look at what equity issues might exist, if it was tax compliance issues, incomplete applications. We're going to look at all of that to see what additional services we need to be providing to those businesses. In terms of empowerment zones, we prioritize low-income census tracts and high poverty areas based on unemployment, so that the empowerment zones sort of fall into that generally. And I think you might have been referring to the community trust funds, the prior empowerment zone funds. Is that what you're referring to? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we did actually deploy some of those funds also in this round of funding, and we'll be looking at how to use those dollars to support small businesses moving forward in the following year as well, probably through some kind of one-on-one technical assistance.
Thank you, Sylvie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Ms. Howard, Galia Howard, you were actually supposed to testify, but given the time constraints that we have, I'm going to ask if you can just submit your testimony for the record, and then you just be available as we go over this last half hour to respond as you have been doing. All right.
No problem. No problem. Thank you, Council President.
All right. Thank you. Let me see. Next up, we have Councilwoman Gim. Councilwoman Gim?
I'm on.
Okay.
Thank you. First of all, because we don't have much time, I just want to say thank you to Marissa Waxman and her team, to Rob DeBow. I know these have been extraordinarily difficult times, and I just want a chance to say thank you for your work and for being very clear and responsive on all your communications, certainly to our office and I'm sure to the rest of council. I also want to say the same to Sylvie Gallard and to your team over at Commerce. I know you had to move very quickly early on a absolute crisis. It's one of the concerns that I share with many of my other colleagues, that we certainly are concerned about a 50% cut to your budget, because I think we are going to have to come out of this with a buy local, buy Philadelphia, buy small campaign if we're going to see our neighborhoods and our community really bounce back on all of this. It's really important. So a couple of really quick questions I had for you. So I think one reality of the COVID crisis is that there's a number of returning citizens who are coming out of being released early. Do you have an update that you can either send over to us or maybe give a very short summary on the Fair Chance Hiring Initiative? It reimburses local employers who hire formerly incarcerated individuals. It's had some changes to the program by converting over around grants and other types of things. So I know you've been particularly innovative, but have you seen any changes in that program? Is it still in effect, especially now?
It is, yes, thank you, Councilwoman. It is still in effect, and I'm happy to send over more details. I know that that the uptake was not as quick as we would like, but we now have at least a couple dozen businesses that are enrolled in that program and are hiring folks. I know that we needed to do some more outreach in terms of, and also work with a couple other partners in terms of the actual matching of employees and those businesses. I'm happy to send you an update on that.
Yeah, and I think it would be helpful also just to share it out with council, because it is a really good opportunity for workforce development. And again, as we're seeing like an early release of a number of formerly incarcerated individuals, it's an important part of business development. It's another means in which employers and our communities can access resources and supports from you. And so that's very much appreciated. So I think Councilwoman Parker kind of went through the clarifications on your budget, which I think were really important. Obviously, I think that we're very interested in seeing about a 1/3 drop in your team, whether we're going to be able to do small local-based campaigns. Have you thought? I mean, let's separate out the conversation about whether we can restore some of your budget, but have you thought about whether Commerce could help lead and structure like a buy local, buy small effort here, or what has that traditionally looked like for you? Do you see it mostly being done through marketing? Do you see it mostly being done through communication? I mean, local-based communications, like per district and neighborhood?
Yeah, so, and I do want to say for this fiscal year, while the cut is really deep in terms of general fund, we are going to rely on some, prior allocations in order to really make sure, we are incredibly committed and have strong resolve about meeting the need with whatever we have. And a lot of that is through partnerships as well. So working much more closely. I'm probably on the phone with Ann Nevins at PIDC every other day or every day. And with all of our ethnic chambers, we have weekly calls with the CDCs, with the micro lenders, the CDFIs. In terms of a buy local type of campaign, we are working with Visit Philly on trying to promote the businesses that are currently open, and hopefully we'll be rolling something out soon. And we will be. But I've been really concerned about that in terms of there are businesses that are out there that are on the verge, that are they're getting really creative and they're trying to do business. So you'll also see we have a Takeout Tuesday campaign on our social media account. I encourage you all to join the Takeout Tuesday campaign and go out and get takeout on Tuesdays. But we are trying to do that, and we'll be getting creative in terms of our commercial corridor money as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd love to stay in touch because I know other cities have been creative in this area. And if we can come out of this with a real commitment around it, especially if it can be like neighborhood and district based, I know it needs significant support. But if it's a little bit beyond just a marketing campaign and sort of, comms, I think that's more of what I'm interested in helping do whatever I can to be supportive around all of that. So thank you.
That'd be great.
Sylvie, to you and your whole team.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council President.
Good. Thank you, Councilwoman. Next up, we have Councilwoman Fiona Sanchez.
Thank you, Council President. And thank you, Sylvie. I think a lot of my colleagues cover a lot of the questions. I want to go back to Breslin and the Revenue Department. Council President Clark, I'm very, very concerned, and I just want to emphasize what Councilwoman Bass said earlier around creating opportunities for us to help small businesses. And I want to push back a little bit on the administration's unwillingness to look at some sort of amnesty program because it impacts our cash flow. The very thought that we have access to PICA, we have access to a liquidity fund, but we do not want to engage in anything that will help provide some predictability for small businesses to make a decision around taking a chance to restart, and to use Councilman Dom's analogy, a smart restart. One of the things that I've learned in our previous amnesty efforts, and the reasons they've been expensive, have been because we continue to use the outside vendors, not even our current vendors, to do this work. And I don't want to take this amnesty situation off the table. I believe not only do we need a robust amnesty plan for our small businesses, we need an UPA plan for small businesses. We need all of those things because, as Sylvia is testifying to, and Karen, we don't have all the money to give businesses. But what we have the ability to do is not be a detriment to their decision making about whether they take a chance in starting up again. And so I'd like to continue to work with Councilwoman Bass on what would a different type of amnesty program that puts small businesses on payment plans that makes sense in helping them, again, reconsider opening up, that everything be on the table. And it is daunting to me that we would say we don't want to disrupt our cash flow, and that we would jeopardize, given the unprecedented time that we are, is hugely concerning to me. And again, I want to reemphasize the issue of Councilman Dom around the return on investment. And again, this goes to the key of the poverty plan, where we all agreed that the return on investment on EITC was hugely important. And that what we've learned through these efforts is that, for every dollar we put in, we're getting dollars back, that kind of decision making would be made when all of us, including the private sector, recognizes important to me is troubling. And so if in fact we were going to make the investment on the return of investment on EITC, what is in fact you proposing to eliminate as the current budget is designated, and what is the potential lost revenue for not making that investment? Did you calculate that in your equation?
So there's two things there. One was on the amnesty discussion, and then one was on the EITC. On the amnesty, I think what both Commissioner Breslin and I said is that we agree that everything should be on the table. We have some concerns about amnesty because what happens after an amnesty is in the years after it, collections go down. So the cost that we were talking about wasn't the cost of the amnesty, implementing the amnesty, it was the cost in lost collections in the future years. But that is something that we should talk about as part of this process. On the EITC, we really didn't do the type of analysis that you're talking about. We did do an analysis of wanting to make sure that we kept in place revenue's ability to collect and to help administer the relief programs that are in place. But if the commissioner wants to add to that, go ahead, Frank.
Yeah. On the amnesty piece, I'll just say that, as we said, it's a tool for the toolbox, but I think that, it's a very broad concept of amnesty, and it tries to generate a lot of money in a short period of time, which adds a lot of stress to the process and doesn't make it a very efficient process. So I think there's other ways to give relief to taxpayers. And generally, let me add, amnesty programs traditionally require a payment up front, and I'm not sure in the financial climate right now that an amnesty program structured like a traditional amnesty really helps businesses get where they want to. So I think we're on the same page in that we realize that businesses are going to need innovative terms, and we want to be able to provide that, and it's going to include interest and penalty relief, and we want to be able to provide that too. We want to really reach out and hear what businesses need, and then build a strategy around what businesses need to come back and be successful and get compliant. So, and in terms of the EITC, we did not...
Frank, I just said one thing to that, and we also want to make sure that what we do now is tailored to helping people who really need the help, and make sure that we're not also kind of sweeping in people who may have not paid for reasons other than not having ability to pay before. But to Frank's point, that's stuff that we can talk about as we look at what kind of relief we want to provide. Sorry, Frank, go ahead.
Okay, and then I just wanted to add to the EITC because I didn't talk about any of the cuts. I mean, besides the cuts that we took to EITC, the department took significant cuts. We did reduce 26 positions in the departments. There are vacancies that we won't be filling, and $2 million in cuts to class 200 and 300 that include those EITC cuts. So we really looked at it with an eye to being able to keep services, whether that's revenue generation or whether that's customer assistance programs. And again, you know, I've been, and the department has been a supporter of EITC, and we really realize the benefits. There are a lot of other supporters that have been out there that we've partnered with, so that'll be part of the process too, to see how that works and where their funding can come from, because as everyone has said, this is a really important poverty reduction program, and we do acknowledge that.
Thank you, Council President. I know that I won't have a time for the second round. We're not talking about anything traditional now. We're in an unprecedented time. And when we have these discussions and we say, you know, traditional amnesty, or we have people trying to make a decision, do they take a shot back at opening up their business? And so we can sit here and debate about 95% of something, of nothing, or 50% of something. We have to send a message, and that's why the whole discussion around commerce and this, what does recovery, we have to send a message that we are not going to cash flow people for our own good and not look at how do we get businesses open and how do we get people back in jobs. And so this is nothing traditional of what we've done in the past. This is really about thinking outside the box, and it's very, very troubling that we're thinking this small and really not thinking about how our debt will make or break someone's decision to open up again. I can look forward to the continuing conversation. I'm just very, very alarmed and concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. We had 12 minutes. We have 3 members of council with questions, so we'll go through these quickly. Again, make their answers as short as possible. We had Councilwoman Gilmore Richardson, and then Councilwoman Gauthier, and then Councilman O, in that order.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Council President. Really quickly, I just had a question about the various tax credit programs that we have. Typically, the yearly caps on how much money can be expended for each program is allocated in the budget. And just for the record, if you could review that and also talk about some of the programs where, the tax credits are not up to 100% capacity. And then the second thing is around our city's budgeting model. We had a hearing in the end of February in Councilmember Dom's Committee on Fiscal Stability, where we talked about the city's preparedness for any potential economic recession. And I wanted you just to talk about, because we reviewed at that hearing, information relative to all city departments moving to a program-based budgeting model. And typically in the third year of a program-based budgeting model, you start to realize some savings. Do you think it's prudent for us as a city to look at a zero-based budgeting model as we move forward out of COVID-19? And then my third question, I just wanted to get on the record again from yesterday, was around the Cultural Fund and funding specifically for the African American Museum, and also if their maintenance fee that was included in our FY20 budget, will that be sustained for FY21? I think that was around $60,000. So thank you so much. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Anyone? Okay. Thank you. And I also wanted to include Councilwoman Bass as the last council member that was on the list. So next will be, I'm just trying to keep order here, Councilwoman Gauthier.
Thank you. Sorry, do you want us to answer these questions or just get back to you?
Yeah, please. I was waiting for you.
So, sorry, I was muted. I didn't realize it. Frank, do you want to do the tax credit question?
Sure, I'll pass that to Rebecca Lopez. Chris, Rebecca, if you want to just give a quick overview of the tax credits. And if anyone near the cap, I don't think they are.
Please be mindful, we have a real strict time limit because they will cut us off at 12:30, as was witnessed yesterday.
We can supply that. Might be easier because there's a bunch of credits. We'll supply all the credits and let you know if any are near the cap and how much room there is. So we'll do that.
Okay.
Okay, then we'll just move on to the second question about zero-based budgeting, and I'll let Marissa answer that.
Hi, thank you. So we talked about program-based budgeting, which really links performance to how much you're spending to get that performance. And the Councilwoman asked if we expect to see some savings from that. As we had testified in the prior hearing, we don't think that automatically shows us, where there are savings. It lets us know, particularly as a city, that, we were still recovering from the last recession and knew that that was having ongoing impacts on our services. It helps guide us to know really where, if we invest, what results we'll get. So good examples are, if we wanted to have increased frequency in terms of health inspectors visiting restaurants, we were able to see how investing some dollars would shorten that time. We can also now, in a different way, since we have to go the other direction, get a sense of, okay, if we reduce dollars, what does that do to our performance? And so a lot of our departments use that to assess relative impacts of cuts in one area versus another. So as we're bringing down our spending to reflect our revised fiscal circumstances, what we're doing is seeing what impact that's going to have on our service level. In terms of zero-based budgeting, that's basically where you start from scratch and rethink everything. And when we had to go forward with reduction scenarios, that's a bit of what we asked. There's some, if you're taking a small cut, 2%, 3%, you can spread that over everything or see what you need to do. As folks were asked for the initial round of the budget, and then again, as we had to go back for the second round, when we were talking about larger cuts, we asked departments to really think about what services might the city just no longer provide? What lines of business are we no longer in? Either because they're not core things that we know we need to preserve, or because we know that they're outside service delivery mechanisms or funding sources. And so we asked departments to take that into account as they were making proposals, as opposed to just sort of saying, okay, 10% off the top for everything. And so while it's not moving wholesale to zero-based budgeting, what we did ask departments to really consider is, what do we do? Should we do it at all? Should we do it in the same framework? And so a lot of the revisions that you're seeing in the FY21 budget reflect some of that thinking, where we look towards other service delivery mechanisms or other funding sources for things that, the city alone isn't the sole provider or isn't the, provider of last resort in areas like healthcare or things like that.
Okay, thank you. Next, Councilwoman Gauthier.
Thank you, Council President. I have one question for Commerce. The Commerce Department offers a variety of programs that provide critical support to our neighborhood business districts and commercial corridors. Can you give us your thoughts about how the proposed FY21 reductions will affect majority Black and Brown communities versus our downtown business areas?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Councilwoman. So that really is our focus. For the next year, we are prioritizing small businesses, minority businesses, neighborhood businesses, and the unemployed. That'll really be our core focus. There will be some amount of time just on our normal revenue generating projects just to bring more dollars into the city, but the focus will be on the corridors. And we are keeping our CDCs whole, our minority chambers whole. There will be a slight reduction in terms of our in-store program, and we will not have the Safe Cam program. It'll be paused, but other than that, we actually hope through the CDBG dollars to provide more dollars to the micro lenders for business technical assistance, especially related to like safety and technology and things like that. So we really, in thinking about our budget, we were really thoughtful about not having any negative impact on our communities. We'll just have to be leaner and work harder as a team.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilwoman. She recognizes Councilwoman Bass. She was inserted in there, and Councilman O. Yes. 5 minutes. Councilwoman Bass?
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to say a couple of things, and I know we're short on time, so I'll be very brief. So I just wanted to say the first thing is, in hearing today's testimony, I can't help but feel that we have a really bad formula in front of us, and I know that everyone has worked really hard to put their best foot forward. But when we talk about keeping the tax abatements, when we talk about not having amnesty readily on the table, when we talk about cuts to commerce and raising real estate taxes, and when we step back from council's poverty reduction plan, that can be seen as nothing more than a bad formula for moving forward. And as I said earlier, we can't go back to the city that we had. We have to move forward and be the city that we want and that we really need. Now, there's a saying I like to employ, which is the reward for good work is more work. And it almost feels like in Philadelphia, the reward for paying your taxes is that you get to pay more taxes. And that shouldn't be the case. For those of us who are paying our taxes and all of our constituents out there, we need to make sure that we're looking out for their best interests also. So I really just, I had to emphasize that. I had some other questions, but I'll hold them and submit them for the record, Mr. President, in the interest of time.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Councilman O.
Thank you, Council President. I'm just going to emphasize what Councilman Bass said. The taxes are putting people out of their homes, the sheriff sales, the assessments, and now more taxes. And every time someone gets a tax, it's not just for that year. Every assessment increase that is improper, every tax increase, we are losing home ownership in this city at an alarming rate. One of the pride of our city was the number of people, especially people in our minority communities, especially people who inherited homes that had assets and property that they could move forward on. That window is really, really shrinking. I would say what I haven't heard is this: postpone. Postpone your big expenditures. Is it going to kill this administration or this city to wait 9 months, a year and a half on important projects that don't have to be done right now? Because if I had to put up a tax increase, tax amnesty, or any of these things, I'd say use $50 million from the fund balance. Take it down, because you will recover that. And I want to know, where is the money? Like, we reduced the prison population by 1,000. Where's the savings? We have other expenditures that have been reduced. And in my time in this council body, we were looking at about $4 billion in the general fund, 3.8, 4 billion, 4.1. Now we're like over 5. We're reducing it to 4.9, and we can't find savings. So postpone. Thank you.
So I'd like to respond. So part of what we're doing is postponing. So for example, we're postponing the expansion of pre-K and community schools. We are also reframing the way we did the rent assist program, so it's paid for with federal money. A lot of what we looked at was looking at or our street cleaning citywide. We're postponing that too. So there's a lot of postponing in this. And I want you to think that there were just a few areas that were cut in this budget. Everything was looked at. Many things were postponed. Many things were cut. So I just want you to know that we did exactly what you're talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Thank you, Rob. The hour is here, unfortunately. Again, real quick, we do have 2 callback dates in the event that we don't get the responses as promised by witnesses today. So there being no additional questions from this committee, at this particular time, we will stand in recess until Wednesday, May 20th, 2020 at 9:30 a.m., at which time we will reconvene on Microsoft Teams. Thank you all very much. And again, I apologize for the condensed time frame, but it is the world that we live in today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. President.
You're welcome.
Thank you.